The fourth quarter numbers are catastrophic, and if we don't stabilize by midnight, we're looking at a hostile takeover by Valentine Industries. The words hung in the air of the Elite Airways corporate boardroom like a death sentence. David Mitchell, CEO and founder of Elite Airways, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. Around him, 12 board members shifted nervously in their leather chairs, the city lights of Phoenix twinkling 45 floors below through floor-to-ceiling windows. How catastrophic, David asked, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around his company. Margaret Foster, the chief financial officer, slid a tablet across the table. We're down 18% from last year. Customer satisfaction scores are dropping and our competitors are gaining market share every quarter. David studied the numbers, but his concentration broke when his phone buzzed against the table. A text from his daughter Zara lit up the screen. Flight delayed, but should make it, can't wait to ring in 2025 together. Dad. A rare smile crossed his face. After months of boardroom battles and corporate crises, seeing his daughter for New Year's Eve was the only thing keeping him sane. Zara was flying in from New York, where she'd been finishing her final semester at the Parsons School of Design. They hadn't seen each other since October, and he'd been looking forward to this reunion for weeks. David Margaret's voice pulled him back to the crisis at hand. Sorry, continue. The union is threatening strikes if we don't meet their pension demands by January 15th. Marketing is hemorrhaging money on campaigns that aren't working. And now we have reports of customer service complaints rising by 40%. Another buzz. David glanced down discreetly. Another text from Zara gate agent being weird about my ticket. Probably nothing. A chill ran down David's spine. Weird how his daughter was flying first class on his airline with elite status that should guarantee her red carpet treatment. What could possibly be weird about her ticket, David? We need decisive action, pressed Robert Harrison, the oldest board member and David's former mentor. Valentine Industries is circling like vultures. We need to cut costs, streamline operations, maybe consider merging with a larger carrier. David had built Elite Airways from nothing 15 years ago, starting with 2 planes and a dream of treating every passenger with dignity. The thought of losing his company to corporate raiders made his stomach turn. We're not selling, David said firmly. This airline represents something more than profit margins, like what Margaret challenged, because shareholders care about returns, not philosophy. David's phone buzzed again. This time, instead of a text, it was a call. Zara's number flashed on the screen. She never called unless something was seriously wrong. He rejected the call, sending it to voicemail. Whatever was happening at the gate would have to wait 5 more minutes. Like treating people fairly, David continued addressing Margaret's question. Like creating a company culture where dignity matters more than dress codes, where respect isn't earned by the price of your ticket. Several board members exchanged glances. They'd heard David's value speeches before, but tonight with the company bleeding money, his idealism felt out of place. His phone buzzed with another text. Dad, they won't let me board. Can you call me? David's blood pressure spiked. His daughter was being denied boarding on his own airline. Every instinct screamed at him to excuse himself and handle this immediately, but the board was watching his every move, waiting for any sign of weakness. We have until midnight to submit our response to the Valentine proposal, Robert said, checking his watch. It's already 11:15. We need a decision. David's phone rang again. Zara. This time he couldn't ignore it. Excuse me for one moment, David said, standing and walking toward the windows. He answered the call, keeping his voice low. Dad Zara's voice was strained, trying to stay composed, but clearly upset. What's happening, sweetheart? The gate agent says my ticket is fake. She's calling security. Dad, I just want to come home. The last sentence hit him like a physical blow. His brilliant, strong daughter, who'd never asked him to use his influence for anything, was scared and asking for help. Tell me exactly where you are, David said quietly. Gate A7, Terminal 3, David's terminal, his airline. His employees were humiliating his daughter. I'll handle this, David said, already walking toward the door. Don't let them intimidate you. You belong exactly where you are. David Margaret called after him. We need to vote on the Valentine proposal. David paused at the door, looking back at the board members who controlled his company's fate. Then he thought of his daughter alone, and frightened in his own terminal. The vote is postponed, David said. There's something more important I need to handle downstairs. Zara Mitchell stood in the Elite Airways priority boarding lane, clutching her phone and trying to process what had just happened. The terminal buzzed with New Year's Eve. Energy-delayed flights, frustrated travelers, and the constant announcement of last-minute gate changes echoing through the corridors. At 22, Zara had her father's quiet confidence and her late mother's artistic eye. Tonight, she wore a vintage denim jacket covered in hand-sewn patches from her fashion design projects paired with dark jeans and worn sneakers that had carried her through countless late nights in Parsons's design studios. Her natural hair was pulled back in a colorful silk headband she'd designed herself, and her canvas messenger bag was stuffed with sketchbooks and fabric samples. She didn't look like Elite Airways' typical first-class passenger, and she knew it. But she'd earned her spot in that cabin, fair and square with the ticket purchased using her own savings and elite status inherited from her father's employee benefits. The priority lane was nearly empty, just 2 passengers ahead of her, both dressed in expensive suits and carrying designer luggage. Behind the glass partition economy boarding was chaos, incarnate families wrangling crying children, and business travelers shouting into phones and college students dragging overstuffed backpacks. Zara approached the podium, where Victoria Blackwood presided like a runway model who'd wandered into the wrong industry. Victoria was stunning in the way that made people stop and stare, tall blonde wearing a perfectly tailored black Armani suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry subtle but expensive, and her posture screamed authority. But when Victoria looked up from her computer screen and saw Zara approaching, her expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed disgust. Economy boarding begins in 20 minutes, Victoria said without looking at Zara's boarding pass. Her voice was crisp, educated with just enough ice to make the dismissal clear. Please wait in the appropriate area. Zara blinked, taken aback by the immediate assumption. I'm sorry, but I'm first class. Seat 2A. Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose in what looked like amusement rather than surprise. She finally glanced down at the boarding pass Zara was holding, then back up at her outfit with obvious disapproval. Let me see that, Victoria said, extending one manicured hand. Zara handed over her boarding pass, watching as Victoria examined it like a detective studying evidence of a crime. The pass was legitimate. Zara had printed it herself that morning from the Elite Airways app, using her own frequent flyer account. Victoria carried the pass to her scanner, which immediately beeped green and displayed passenger confirmed. Elite status, seat 2A on the screen. Instead of satisfaction, Victoria's face showed annoyance as if the machine had personally betrayed her. There's obviously a system error, Victoria announced loud enough for the other passengers in line to hear. This ticket shows irregularities. What kind of irregularities, Zara asked, keeping her voice calm but feeling her pulse quicken. The scanner just confirmed it. Victoria glanced at the screen, which still clearly displayed Zara's confirmation, then back at Zara, with the look of someone who'd caught a shoplifter red-handed. The system has been glitching all evening, Victoria lied smoothly. Student standby passengers sometimes get upgraded accidentally due to technical issues. We need to verify your actual reservation. I'm not standby, Zara said firmly. I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago. I have elite status through my father's account. The mention of family connections seemed to irritate Victoria further. In her world, status was something you earned through beauty breeding or business success, not something inherited from parents. Miss, I've been managing this gate for 8 years. I know our elite passengers, and I know when something doesn't add up. Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Your presentation doesn't match our first-class standards. The word presentation hit like a slap. Zara looked down at her outfit clothes that represented hours of creative work pieces that expressed her personality and artistic vision. To Victoria, they apparently screamed economy class imposter. "Are you saying my clothes disqualify me from a seat I legally purchased?" Zara asked, her voice rising slightly. "I'm saying that Elite Airways maintains certain standards for our premium cabin experience." Victoria replied, her tone growing sharper. "Standards that extend beyond just having a piece of paper." Behind Zara, she heard the shuffling of expensive shoes and the clearing of a throat. She turned to see a distinguished-looking white man in his 50s checking a gold Rolex with obvious impatience. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of boardroom meetings and country club memberships. Victoria's entire demeanor transformed when she saw him. Her smile brightened, her posture straightened, and her voice took on a warm, apologetic tone. "Mr. Preston, so sorry for the delay. We're just resolving a ticketing confusion with this young lady who seems to have ended up in the wrong line." Preston Montgomery III looked at Zara with the same expression he might reserve for someone who'd tracked mud through his mansion. Everything about him screamed old money, from his perfectly tailored navy suit to his Italian leather briefcase to the signet ring that caught the terminal lights. "Look," Miss Preston said, addressing Zara with the patronizing tone of someone explaining traffic rules to a child. "We all have places to be tonight, important places. Why don't you just head back to your actual gate and let the adults board?" The casual dismissal being called anything but an adult when she was 22 and had earned her place here made Zara's cheeks flush with anger. But she'd learned from her father to stay calm under pressure. "I am an adult," Zara said, turning to face Preston fully. "And I paid for this seat just like you did. Probably more, actually, since I didn't get a corporate discount." Preston laughed, a sound like barking that carried no humor. "I seriously doubt that. My company paid $6,000 for this seat. You look like someone hoping they'll have extra peanuts in coach." Several other passengers in line chuckled, and Zara felt the familiar sting of being turned into entertainment for people who thought her presence was inherently ridiculous. Victoria seized the moment to regain control. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. You're holding up our priority passengers with this misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding," Zara said, pulling out her phone to show the Elite Airways app with her confirmed reservation. "Look, it's right here in the system." But Victoria waved away the phone without looking at it. "Apps can be manipulated, miss. Screenshots can be faked. I need official verification, and until I have it, you cannot board this aircraft." Zara stared at Victoria, realizing she was trapped in a nightmare scenario where facts didn't matter, where her legitimate ticket meant nothing because she didn't look like Victoria's idea of a first-class passenger. "Then verify it," Zara said quietly. "Call your supervisor, check the system, but don't just dismiss me because of what I'm wearing." Victoria's smile was cold and final. "I am the supervisor, and I've made my decision." The standoff between Zara and Victoria had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the gate area. Passengers looked up from their phones, gate agents from other airlines craned their necks, and even the cleaning staff had slowed their work to watch the drama unfold. Victoria Blackwood stood behind her podium like a fortress, one perfectly manicured hand resting on her computer keyboard, the other holding Zara's boarding pass like evidence in a trial. Her expression radiated the confidence of someone who'd never been successfully challenged by anyone she deemed beneath her station. Miss Victoria said, her voice carrying across the gate area with theatrical clarity, "I've explained the situation multiple times. There's clearly been an error in our booking system that's resulted in your receiving an upgrade you're not entitled to. Rather than continue to argue, why don't you allow me to help you find your actual assigned seat?" Zara felt every eye in the terminal boring into her. A few passengers had their phones out, some recording, others just scrolling through social media, while occasionally glancing up at the free entertainment. "There is no error," Zara said, keeping her voice level despite her growing frustration. "Scan the ticket again, check my frequent flyer number, call the reservations desk, but stop assuming I'm lying just because I don't match your expectations." Preston Montgomery shifted impatiently behind her, making exaggerated sighs and checking his watch with theatrical annoyance. "This is exactly why the world is going to hell," Preston muttered to the woman next to him loud enough for everyone to hear. "Everyone thinks they're entitled to things they haven't earned. No respect for order, no understanding of how society actually works." A few passengers nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Near the windows overlooking the tarmac, Maria Santos sat with her 6-year-old son Diego, both of them dressed in their Sunday best for their flight to visit family in New York. Maria was a night shift nurse at Phoenix General, and this trip represented months of saving and planning. She watched the confrontation with growing unease, recognizing the tone Victoria was using, the same tone she'd heard in hospital administrative offices when she'd tried to advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. "Mommy, why is that lady being mean?" Diego whispered in Spanish. "Shh, mijo," Maria replied, pulling him closer. Sometimes adults forget how to be nice, but even as she tried to shield her son from the ugliness unfolding, Maria felt her own anger building. She'd been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment too many times to count. Victoria, sensing that her audience was growing restless with the delay, decided to escalate. "Miss, I'm going to ask you one final time to step away from this gate. You're disrupting the boarding process for our legitimate first-class passengers." "I am a legitimate first-class passenger," Zara replied, her patience finally fraying. "You scanned my ticket. Your own system confirmed it. What more do you need? I need you to understand your place," Victoria said, the mask of professional courtesy finally slipping to reveal the contempt beneath. The words hung in the air like a slap. Several passengers gasped audibly. Maria Santos stood up from her chair, her maternal instincts overriding her desire to avoid conflict. "Excuse me," Maria called out, her voice cutting through the tension, "but that young woman has been nothing but polite while you've been incredibly rude. If her ticket's scanned, why are you still questioning her?" Victoria turned toward Maria with the look of someone who'd just been addressed by the help. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Please remain seated and wait for your boarding group." "It concerns me when I see someone being treated unfairly," Maria replied, her voice gaining strength. "I teach my son to stand up for what's right." Preston whirled around to face Maria, his face flushed with irritation. "Maybe you should teach your son about respecting authority and not getting involved in situations that don't involve him." The racist undertone wasn't lost on anyone in the gate area. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably while others pulled out their phones to start recording. Little Diego tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, let's go home." But Maria wasn't backing down now. Years of being dismissed, ignored, and condescended to had reached a boiling point. "My son is learning that silence in the face of injustice is the same as agreement," Maria said firmly. "And I won't teach him to be silent when someone is being treated badly for no good reason." Victoria's composure was beginning to crack. She was used to intimidating people into compliance through sheer force of personality and position, but Maria Santos wasn't backing down. Security, Victoria called into her headset. "I need assistance at gate A7 immediately." The word security sent a chill through the gate area. What had begun as an argument about a boarding pass was now escalating into something much more serious. Zara felt her heart rate spike. She'd seen enough videos online to know how these situations could spiral out of control. "This is ridiculous," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling my father." "Your father can't help you now," Victoria said with satisfaction. "You should have thought about consequences before trying to board a flight with fraudulent documentation." Fraudulent Zara stared at Victoria in disbelief. "You're accusing me of fraud. I'm stating facts," Victoria replied coldly. "You presented documentation that doesn't match your profile, refused to accept correction, and are now disrupting operations. That's fraud and disorderly conduct." Preston nodded approvingly. Finally, someone with backbone. "This generation thinks they can lie and manipulate their way into anything." But not everyone in the gate area agreed. Rebecca Walsh, a third-grade teacher from Phoenix flying to visit her sister in Brooklyn, had been watching the confrontation with growing dismay. She'd seen enough playground bullies to recognize one when she saw it even in a designer's suit. "Excuse me," Rebecca said, standing up and addressing Victoria directly. "I've been sitting here for an hour watching you interact with passengers. You've been polite to everyone who looks like you and hostile to everyone who doesn't. That's not customer service, that's discrimination." Victoria's face flushed red. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you've observed, but I've observed you making assumptions based on appearance rather than facts." Rebecca interrupted, her teacher voice cutting through Victoria's protest. "That young woman has been respectful throughout this entire interaction while you've been increasingly aggressive and accusatory." More passengers began to murmur among themselves. The tide was turning and Victoria could feel her control slipping. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced to the gate area, "I apologize for this disruption. We'll have this resolved momentarily when security arrives to assist with removing disruptive individuals from the boarding area." The threat was clear. Not just Zara, but anyone who supported her could face removal. Maria Santos looked down at her young son, then back at Zara, who was now scrolling through her phone with shaking hands. Diego Maria said quietly, "Remember this moment. Remember that sometimes doing the right thing is scary, but that doesn't mean we don't do it." She walked over to Zara and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mija, you're not alone in this." Zara looked up from her phone, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Victoria watched this small act of solidarity with growing alarm. If other passengers started actively supporting Zara, the situation could spiral completely out of her control. "Ma'am, please return to your seat immediately," Victoria commanded Maria. "You're interfering with airline security procedures." "I'm supporting a fellow passenger who's being treated unfairly," Maria replied. "And I'm teaching my son that silence in the face of injustice makes you part of the problem." The gate area had become a microcosm of larger social tensions, with clear battle lines drawn between those who supported Victoria's authority and those who recognized her behavior as prejudice dressed up in professional language. And in the middle of it all, Zara Mitchell stood with her phone in her hand, about to make the call that would change everything. Officer Kane arrived at Gate A7 with the swagger of a man who believed his uniform made him right in every situation. At 29, he was built like a former high school football player who'd never quite left the locker room, broad shoulders, buzz cut, and the kind of confidence that came from rarely being questioned. He approached Victoria's podium without even glancing at Zara or the gathered passengers, immediately deferring to the authority figure who'd summoned him. "What's the situation here, ma'am?" Kane asked Victoria, his hand resting casually on his radio. Victoria's relief at having backup was palpable. Her smile returned brighter and more victorious than before. "Officer Kane, thank you for responding so quickly. We have a passenger attempting to board with fraudulent documentation. She's become increasingly agitated and is now disrupting our operations." Kane finally looked at Zara, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious judgment. Everything about his expression said he'd already decided who was telling the truth. "Miss, I'm going to need to see some identification in your boarding documentation." Kane said, his tone official but already accusatory. Zara handed over her driver's license and boarding pass, her hands steady despite her racing heart. She'd dealt with enough authority figures in her life to know that staying calm was crucial. Kane examined her ID, then the boarding pass, then looked back at Victoria. "What specifically makes you think this is fraudulent?" "The passenger profile doesn't match our first-class demographics," Victoria replied smoothly. "Additionally, she's refused to accept our verification procedures and has become confrontational when questioned about the discrepancy." From his seat in the corner, James Rodriguez had been watching the entire confrontation unfold with growing disgust. At 45, James was a retired military pilot who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to work for the Phoenix Fire Department. He'd flown civilian airlines for decades and knew discrimination when he saw it. James stood up slowly, his military bearing evident in every movement. Despite being Hispanic, his years in uniform had taught him how to command respect from other authority figures. Officer James called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Before you proceed, you might want to know that I've been recording this entire interaction." Kane spun around to face James, immediately defensive. "Sir, this is not your concern." It became my concern the moment I watched that gate agent repeatedly ignore her own computer system's confirmation that this young woman's ticket is legitimate, James replied calmly. He held up his phone, which had been recording for the past 10 minutes. "I've got the whole thing. The scan that came up green the agent's refusal to accept her own system's verification, the escalating hostility towards passengers who spoke up." Victoria's face went pale. In her focus on intimidating Zara, she'd forgotten about the other passengers who might be documenting her behavior. "Sir, you need to stop recording immediately," Kane demanded. "This is an active security investigation." "Actually, officer, I have every right to record in a public space," James replied, his tone respectful but firm. "And as a former military pilot with over 20 years of flying experience, I can tell you that what I've witnessed here tonight isn't security protocol. It's harassment." Kane found himself caught between two authority figures, Victoria, who'd called him in, and James, whose military bearing and calm confidence made him difficult to dismiss. "Let me see that recording," Kane said, reaching for James's phone. "I don't think so," James replied smoothly, pocketing the device. "But I'd be happy to provide it to your supervisor along with my formal statement about what I've observed." The mention of supervisors made Kane nervous. He was still young enough in his career that he couldn't afford complaints about mishandling situations. Meanwhile, Rebecca Walsh had been discreetly texting updates to her sister in New York, who worked as a civil rights attorney. Rebecca's sister had immediately advised her to document everything and get other witnesses on record. "Excuse me," Rebecca called out to the growing crowd of passengers. "Is anyone else uncomfortable with what we're witnessing here? Because I think we have a responsibility to speak up." Several passengers shifted nervously, caught between their desire to board their flights and their growing unease about the situation unfolding in front of them. An elderly white man in an expensive suit shook his head disapprovingly. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today. No respect for authority, everyone thinking they're a civil rights activist with a cell phone camera." But a young Latina college student stood up from her seat. "I disagree. I think what we're seeing is someone being profiled and discriminated against, and other passengers having the courage to speak up about it." The gate area was now clearly divided into camps, those who supported Victoria's actions and those who recognized them as discriminatory. The tension was palpable, with passengers taking sides and the situation growing more volatile by the minute. Victoria, realizing she was losing control of the narrative, decided to go nuclear. "Officer Kane, I want this woman arrested for attempting to board with fraudulent documentation and for creating a public disturbance," she declared, pointing at Zara. Kane looked uncomfortable. Arresting someone for a boarding pass dispute seemed extreme, especially with multiple witnesses recording and questioning the legitimacy of the complaint. "Ma'am, maybe we should try to resolve this without arrests. Has anyone actually verified whether the ticket is legitimate? I've told you it's fraudulent." Victoria snapped, her professional composure finally cracking. "I don't need to verify anything further. I know our passengers, and she doesn't belong in first class." The mask had finally come off. Victoria's real motivation, her belief that Zara didn't belong, was now clear to everyone in the gate area. James Rodriguez stepped forward again. "Officer, I'd like to go on record as stating that I witnessed this gate agent scan that young woman's boarding pass, observed the system confirm her reservation and elite status, and then watched her deny the validity of her own computer system based solely on her visual assessment of the passenger." Maria Santos, still standing beside Zara, added her voice to the growing chorus of opposition. "I saw the same thing. The machine said green light, confirmed passenger. Everything since then has been about what she's wearing and how she looks." Kane found himself in an impossible position. Multiple credible witnesses were contradicting the complaint that had brought him here, but Victoria was insisting on arrests and removal. "Miss Mitchell Kane," said, addressing Zara directly for the first time, "I need you to step over here with me while we sort this out." "Her name is Mitchell?" James asked sharply. "As in David Mitchell?" Kane paused. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "You don't know who David Mitchell is?" James continued, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The CEO of Elite Airways. The man who owns this airline." The color drained from Victoria's face. She'd been so focused on Zara's appearance that she'd never bothered to look at the name on the boarding pass. Kane looked down at the ID in his hand, reading the name properly for the first time. "Zara Mitchell." "That's right," James said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "And unless I'm very much mistaken, you're about to arrest the CEO's daughter for trying to board her father's airplane." The gate area fell silent except for the constant announcements echoing through the terminal. Victoria stared at Zara with dawning horror, realizing the magnitude of her mistake. Preston Montgomery, who'd been smugly supporting Victoria throughout the confrontation, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into his designer luggage. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered. If her father was, she would have said something. Would she? Rebecca Walsh asked pointedly. Or would a decent person expect to be treated with basic respect regardless of who their father is? Zara looked around at the faces staring at her. Some shocked, some embarrassed, others angry that they'd been manipulated into supporting discrimination. "I never wanted to use my father's name," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I just wanted to fly home for New Year's Eve. I wanted to be treated like any other passenger who'd paid for a ticket." She pulled out her phone, scrolling to her father's contact information. "But since treating people with dignity apparently requires a permission slip, I guess it's time to make that call." Victoria watched in growing panic as Zara selected her father's number. Everything she'd worked for, her position, her authority, her career, was about to be destroyed by her own prejudices and poor judgment. "Wait," Victoria said desperately. There's no need to escalate this further. We can resolve this right here." But Zara was done being reasonable with people who'd shown her none in return. Her finger hovered over the call button as she looked around the gate area one more time. "You're right," Zara said to Victoria. "We can resolve this. All you had to do was treat me like a human being." And with that, she pressed call. The phone rang twice before David's familiar voice answered. "Zara, what's happening down there, Dad?" Zara said, her voice finally breaking slightly with relief and exhaustion. "They won't let me board. The gate agent says my ticket is fake, security is here, and they're threatening to arrest me." The gate area had gone completely silent except for the ambient airport noise. Every passenger, every employee, everyone within earshot was straining to hear Zara's side of the conversation. "Tell me exactly what's happening." David's voice was quiet but carried an edge that Zara recognized. It was the voice he used during board meetings when someone had pushed him too far. "The gate agent, Victoria Blackwood, scanned my ticket and it came up confirmed in her system. But she's saying it's fraudulent because I don't look like I belong in first class. She called security, and now Officer Kane wants to arrest me for trying to board with a fake documentation." Victoria Blackwood, hearing her name mentioned, felt her stomach drop to her shoes. She could only imagine what was being said on the other end of that phone call. "Are there witnesses?" David asked. "Yes, several passengers have been recording and speaking up for me. A retired pilot named James Rodriguez, a nurse named Maria Santos, and a teacher named Rebecca Walsh. They've all tried to intervene." David processed this information with the rapid-fire efficiency that had made him a successful CEO. His daughter was being humiliated by his own employees in his own terminal, but she'd somehow gained the support of other passengers who were willing to stand up for her. He felt simultaneously furious and proud. "Dad, I'm sorry I had to call you. I know you're in your meeting, but don't apologize." David interrupted firmly. "You should never have to endure this, ever, from anyone, especially not from people who work for me." Victoria was growing increasingly pale as she realized the implications of what was happening. Officer Kane looked confused, but nervous, sensing that the situation had just shifted dramatically. "What gate are you at?" David asked. "7 Terminal 3. I'll be right there. In the meantime, don't let them intimidate you any further. You have every right to be exactly where you are. Dad, what about your meeting?" The board will wait," David said with finality. Some things are more important than quarterly reports. Victoria couldn't help herself. She stepped closer to Zara, her voice barely a whisper but audible enough for the phone to pick up. "If you're really David Mitchell's daughter, why didn't you say so?" From the beginning, David's voice came through the phone speaker cold and clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, because in a civilized society, basic human decency shouldn't require a permission slip. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She stepped back from Zara as if she'd been burned. "Is that the gate agent?" David asked. "Yes," Zara replied. "Miss Blackwood, can you hear me?" Victoria felt every eye in the gate area turned toward her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I can hear you, Mr. Mitchell." She finally managed her voice barely above a whisper. "Good. I want you to know that this conversation is being recorded. I want you to know that your treatment of my daughter will be reviewed by our board of directors. And I want you to know that your behavior tonight represents everything that's wrong with the culture I've been trying to change at this airline." Victoria's legs felt weak. Her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for was crumbling in real time. "Mr. Mitchell, I was just following protocol." "No." David's voice cut through her excuse. "You were following your prejudices. There's a difference." Officer Kane shifted uncomfortably, realizing he'd walked into a much bigger situation than he'd bargained for. He was a low-level security officer who just threatened to arrest the CEO's daughter based on the complaint of an employee who was clearly in the wrong. Zara David continued, "I need you to know that what happened tonight is not a reflection of the values this airline is supposed to represent. You deserve better. Every passenger deserves better." James Rodriguez, who'd been watching the entire scene unfold, stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, this is James Rodriguez, retired military pilot. I want you to know that your daughter handled herself with remarkable grace under circumstances that would have tested anyone's patience. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. I'm grateful to you and the other passengers who spoke up. That takes courage." Maria Santos, still standing beside Zara, addressed the phone directly. "Mr. Mitchell, your daughter is a credit to you. She never lost her temper, never tried to use your name to get special treatment. She just wanted to be treated fairly. Thank you, Miss Santos. That means more to me than you know." Preston Montgomery, who'd spent the entire evening supporting Victoria's treatment of Zara, had quietly moved to the far side of the gate area, hoping to distance himself from the unfolding disaster. But Rebecca Walsh had noticed his retreat. "Mr. Mitchell, Rebecca called out, you should also know that some passengers actively encourage this discriminatory treatment. A man named Preston Montgomery has been particularly vocal in supporting Miss Blackwood's actions." David's voice took on an even harder edge. "Is that so?" And as Mr. Montgomery still in the gate area, Preston felt like he might throw up. He'd gone from smugly supporting what he thought was justified authority to being publicly called out for supporting discrimination against the CEO's daughter. Dad Zara interjected, "I don't want this to be about revenge. I just want it to stop." "It will stop," David promised, "and it will never happen again. Not to you, not to anyone. I'm on my way down now. Give me 5 minutes." The line went dead, leaving the gate area in stunned silence. Victoria Blackwood stood behind her podium like a defendant awaiting sentencing, while Officer Kane tried to figure out how to extract himself from a situation that had gone disastrously wrong. Zara pocketed her phone and looked around at the faces staring at her, some sympathetic, some embarrassed, others hostile. 5 minutes, she said quietly, to no one in particular. This should be interesting. James Rodriguez hadn't planned to become a social media activist when he woke up that morning, but watching injustice unfold in front of him had triggered every protective instinct he'd developed during his years in the military. As soon as Zara ended her phone call, James pulled up his social media accounts and began uploading the video he'd recorded. "This is what discrimination looks like in 2024, he typed as a caption. Elite Airways gate agent denies boarding to legitimate passenger based solely on appearance. Multiple witnesses. System confirms ticket is valid. Agent insists on calling security anyway. This is happening right now at Phoenix Sky Harbor Gate. A7, within 60 seconds of posting the video, had 12 likes and 3 shares. Within 5 minutes, it had over 100 views and was being reshared across multiple platforms. The Phoenix Sky Harbor Terminal Wi-Fi was carrying the story faster than any news outlet could pick it up. Rebecca Walsh, inspired by James's direct action, had been live-streaming the confrontation on her Instagram account to her teacher friends. Her follower count wasn't huge, but her network included educators' parents and civil rights activists who knew how to amplify important stories. "This is what we talk about when we discuss everyday racism," Rebecca said into her phone camera. "This young woman has done everything right. She has a valid ticket, elite status, perfect composure under pressure, and she's still being treated like a criminal because she doesn't match someone's stereotype of what a first-class passenger should look like." The comments on her live stream were coming in faster than she could read them, but she caught glimpses of supportive messages mixed with ugly responses that proved her point about why this confrontation mattered. Maria Santos, meanwhile, was texting furiously with her sister Carmen, a social worker who specialized in advocacy for marginalized communities. "Carmen, you wouldn't believe what I'm seeing at the airport right now," Maria typed. "They're trying to arrest a college student for flying while black. I'm scared to get too involved because I have Diego with me, but I can't just stand here and watch this happen." Carmen's response was immediate. "Document everything. Get other witnesses' contact information. This is bigger than one incident, it's about pattern and practice. You're doing the right thing by speaking up." But not all the social media activity was supportive. Preston Montgomery, realizing that his own behavior was being recorded and shared, had started his own narrative campaign from his expensive phone. Watching entitled young people cause chaos at airports, he tweeted from his verified account, "No respect for authority or proper procedures. This is why flying has become such a nightmare. Everyone thinks they deserve special treatment." His tweet gained traction among his followers, mostly other wealthy businessmen who saw the situation through the lens of their own prejudices. But the counter-narrative was growing stronger and faster. Officer Kane was growing increasingly uncomfortable as he watched the situation escalate in real time. His radio crackled with updates from airport security headquarters, where his supervisors were already fielding calls from reporters who'd picked up the viral video. "Kane, what's your status at Gate A7?" came the voice from dispatch. "Situation is evolving," Kane replied carefully. "Multiple witnesses, social media documentation, possible VIP involvement." "VIP involvement, explain." Kane glanced around the gate area where dozens of phone cameras were now openly recording the aftermath of the confrontation. "Passenger in question may be related to airline executive. Recommend supervisor response." Victoria Blackwood, meanwhile, was experiencing her worst nightmare in real time. Her phone was buzzing with notifications as her social media accounts were being flooded with comments from people who'd seen the viral videos. Her carefully curated Instagram feed full of fashion photos and luxury travel shots was now dominated by angry comments about her behavior. But the social media storm was just the beginning. In the Elite Airways Operations Center, 3 floors above the gate night shift, managers were scrambling to understand why their airline was suddenly trending on Twitter for all the wrong reasons. "Sir, we've got a situation," the communications manager told his supervisor, holding up his tablet, showing the climbing view counts on multiple videos. "One of our gate agents appears to be denying boarding to a passenger based on appearance, and it's going viral fast." How viral, the supervisor asked, though he was already pulling up the videos on his own device. "Approaching 10,000 views and climbing. The hashtag Elite Airways discrimination is starting to trend." The supervisor watched James's video with growing horror, seeing his company's reputation being destroyed in real time by an employee's prejudice and poor judgment. "Get me the gate agent supervisor immediately," he ordered. "And start drafting a statement. We need to get ahead of this before it completely explodes." But it was already too late to get ahead of anything. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading through networks of activists, journalists, and concerned citizens who recognized the broader implications of what was happening. Back in the gate area, Zara found herself surrounded by a small but growing circle of supporters. James had introduced himself properly and was now coordinating with other passengers to ensure multiple people had documentation of the events. "Have you dealt with anything like this before?" Rebecca asked Zara gently. "Not quite this public," Zara admitted, "but the assumptions, the second-guessing, the way people look at me like I don't belong in certain spaces, that's pretty much constant." Maria Santos nodded knowingly. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Having to prove you deserve to be treated with basic respect." "The worst part," Zara continued, "is that I almost called my dad right at the beginning. I knew one phone call would end this immediately. But I wanted to see if I could be treated fairly on my own merit. You know, I wanted to believe that my father's company was better than this." James looked around the gate area where Victoria was now huddled with Officer Kane in what appeared to be an increasingly desperate conversation. "Your father built something good here," James said. "But good intentions at the top don't automatically translate to good behavior at every level. Sometimes it takes moments like this to expose where the problems really are." Preston Montgomery, who'd been trying to blend into the background, finally approached the group around Zara. His earlier smugness had been replaced by obvious anxiety as he'd watched the viral videos accumulate shares and increasingly critical comments. "Look," Preston said awkwardly, "maybe I was a bit hasty in my judgment earlier. These situations can be confusing." "And no," Rebecca interrupted firmly. "These situations aren't confusing at all. What's confusing is how adults can watch obvious discrimination happening and choose to support it because it doesn't affect them personally." Preston flushed red. "I was just supporting proper procedures." "You were supporting prejudice," Mariah said quietly but firmly. "And now you're trying to distance yourself from it because you realize it's being recorded." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Williams, a tall African-American man in an elite Airways supervisor's uniform, who approached the group with obvious concern and confusion. "Excuse me," Marcus said, addressing the group generally. "I'm Marcus Williams, Terminal Operations Supervisor. I've been getting reports about a situation here, and I wanted to see if I could help resolve things." Victoria immediately rushed over to Marcus, relief evident on her face. "Marcus, thank God you're here. We have a passenger causing a disturbance, refusing to accept verification procedures, and now she's got other passengers worked up." But Marcus had already seen the viral videos on his phone during his walk to the gate. He looked at Zara, then at Victoria, then at the crowd of passengers with their phones out. "Miss Blackwood," Marcus said carefully, "I need to ask you directly. Did you scan this passenger's boarding pass?" "Well, yes, but..." "And what did the system show?" Victoria hesitated. It showed confirmed, but obviously there was an error. Obviously, Marcus interrupted. "Based on what?" "What specifically indicated an error to you?" Victoria gestured vaguely at Zara. "The passenger profile didn't match our first-class demographics." Marcus stared at Victoria with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. As one of the few African-American supervisors at Elite Airways, he'd fought his own battles with assumptions about who belonged where. "Miss Blackwood," Marcus said slowly, "are you telling me that you ignored a positive scan result because of how the passenger looked?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, and Victoria realized she had no good answer that wouldn't confirm exactly what everyone suspected about her motivations. And, in that moment of terrible silence, the elevator doors at the far end of the terminal opened, and David Mitchell stepped out, his expression calm, but his eyes carrying the promise of consequences that would reshape everything. The executive elevator in the Elite Airways building moved between floors with whisper-quiet efficiency, but to David Mitchell, each floor marker felt like a countdown to an explosion. 45 floors to 44, 44 to 43. Each number brought him closer to a confrontation that would define not just his daughter's experience, but the soul of the company he'd built from nothing. David had left the boardroom without explanation, ignoring the protests of directors who couldn't understand how a family matter could take precedence over a potential hostile takeover. But they'd never been parents. They'd never felt the helpless rage of knowing your child was being humiliated while you sat in meetings discussing profit margins. As the elevator descended, David's phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from his communications team. Videos were going viral. Social media was exploding. News outlets were starting to pick up the story. His airline was becoming a symbol of corporate discrimination in real time. But David wasn't thinking about public relations or damage control. He was thinking about the 8-year-old Zara who'd come home from school crying because a teacher had assumed she couldn't afford a field trip. He was thinking about the 16-year-old Zara who'd been followed around department stores by security guards who assumed she was shoplifting. He was thinking about how many times he'd promised her that things would be different when she grew up, that the world was changing, that respect and dignity would eventually be universal rather than privileges granted based on appearance. The elevator passed to the 20th floor. David loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. He wasn't going down there as a CEO in a suit. He was going as a father whose child needed him. His phone rang. Marcus Williams, his terminal operations supervisor. "Sir, I'm at gate A7 now." Marcus said, his voice tight with concern. "The situation is complex. There are multiple witnesses, social media documentation, and frankly, sir, it appears your daughter has been subjected to clear discriminatory treatment." "How is she?" David asked. "She's handling herself remarkably well, sir. She's got community support from other passengers. But Mr. Mitchell, this isn't just about one incident. This appears to be indicative of larger cultural issues within our terminal operations." David absorbed this information as the elevator passed the 10th floor. He'd suspected there were problems. Passenger complaints had been increasing, particularly from minority customers, but he'd trusted his managers to address issues at their level. Clearly, that trust had been misplaced. "Marcus, I need you to document everything, every person involved, every witness statement, every detail. This ends tonight, but I want a complete record of how it happened." "Already in progress, sir. There's one more thing you should know. The gate agent involved is Victoria Blackwood." David recognized the name. Victoria had been hired 2 years ago based on impressive credentials and strong interview performance. She'd consistently received positive performance reviews and customer service commendations. On paper, she was exactly the kind of employee Elite Airways wanted, representing their brand. "Have you worked with Miss Blackwood before?" David asked. Marcus hesitated. "Yes, sir. And I have to say I've always found her to be selective about which passengers receive her best customer service efforts." The careful phrasing told David everything he needed to know. Marcus was diplomatically confirming that Victoria's behavior tonight wasn't an isolated incident. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft chime. David stepped out into the marble-floored lobby of the Elite Airways terminal, but instead of heading directly to Gate A7, he made a detour to the terminal security office. "I need the surveillance footage from Gate A7 for the past hour," David told the night security supervisor, flashing his executive credentials. "Sir, we don't usually—" "This isn't a usual situation," David interrupted. "I need that footage immediately, and I need it preserved for potential legal proceedings." The security supervisor, recognizing both David's authority and the serious tone of his request, quickly pulled up the relevant cameras. David watched in silence as the footage showed the entire confrontation from multiple angles. Victoria's dismissive body language, Zara's patient attempts to comply with requests, the growing involvement of other passengers. "Make copies of everything," David ordered. "And I want a complete report on any similar incidents involving Miss Blackwood in the past 6 months. Sir, that might take some time to compile." "You have until morning," David said firmly. "This is now my top priority, which means it's your top priority." David left the security office and began walking toward Gate A7, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd seen. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was about every passenger who'd been subjected to similar treatment, every family who'd been made to feel unwelcome in his terminals. As he walked through the late-night airport crowds, David passed travelers of every background. Families rushing to catch red-eye flights, business travelers scrolling through phones, college students sleeping across bank seats while waiting for delayed departures. His airline was supposed to serve all of them with equal dignity and respect. Tonight had proved that promise was being broken on his watch. His phone buzzed with another text from Zara. "Dad, please don't make this bigger than it needs to be. I just want to come home." David smiled sadly as he typed back, "Some things need to be big, sweetheart. This is one of them." He rounded the corner toward gate A7 and could see the crowd gathered around the boarding area. Phone cameras were visible throughout the group, and he could hear animated conversations about rights, respect, and responsibility. His daughter had inadvertently started a conversation that needed to happen. David approached the edge of the crowd where he could observe the situation before revealing himself. He wanted to see how his employees behaved when they thought no one important was watching. He wanted to understand the full scope of what Zara had endured. What he saw made his jaw clench with controlled fury. Victoria Blackwood was still arguing with witnesses, still trying to justify her behavior, still treating Zara like an unwelcome intruder rather than a customer who deserved respect. But he also saw something that filled him with pride. His daughter stood in the center of a group of strangers who'd chosen to support her despite having no obligation to do so. She was handling herself with grace, under pressure maintaining her composure while surrounded by conflict. These passengers, Maria Santos, James Rodriguez, Rebecca Walsh, had risked their own comfort and convenience to stand up for a principle. They'd recognized injustice and chosen to act even when silence would have been easier. David took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and stepped forward into the crowd. It was time to remind everyone, his employees, his passengers, and his daughter, what Elite Airways was supposed to stand for. And it was time to prove that when those values were threatened, there would be consequences. The gate area around A7 had transformed into something resembling a town hall, meeting with clear factions emerging and informal leaders organizing their respective sides. What had begun as a simple boarding dispute had evolved into a microcosm of larger social tensions, with each participant forced to choose whether they stood with justice or convenience. James Rodriguez had naturally assumed the role of coordinator for Zara's supporters. His military bearing and calm authority made other passengers gravitate toward his steady presence. He'd spent the past 10 minutes collecting contact information from witnesses and ensuring multiple people had complete video documentation of the events. The key thing, James explained to the growing group of allies, is that we maintain our composure and stick to facts. We've got truth on our side, but the moment anyone loses their temper or gets aggressive, they'll use that to discredit everything we've documented. Rebecca Walsh nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I tell my students about dealing with bullies. Don't give them ammunition to use against you, but don't let them intimidate you into silence either. Maria Santos was keeping one eye on her son Diego, who was fascinated by the drama unfolding around him, and the other on Victoria Blackwood, who seemed to be growing more desperate by the minute. Mija Maria said to Zara, "You've been handling this beautifully. Don't let them make you feel like you're the problem here." But not everyone in the gate area supported Zara's cause. A cluster of passengers had formed around Preston Montgomery, drawn together by their shared discomfort with what they saw as disruptive behavior and disrespect for authority. "This is exactly what's wrong with young people today," complained an elderly white woman with an expensive handbag. "No respect for rules, always ready to cry discrimination when they don't get their way." Preston nodded sagely. "It's the entitlement mentality. Everyone thinks they deserve special treatment, and when they don't get it, they play the victim card and get everyone worked up." A middle-aged businessman in an expensive suit chimed in. "I fly first class regularly, and I've never had problems with the gate agents. Maybe if people dressed appropriately and showed proper respect for procedures, these situations wouldn't arise." Their conversation was loud enough to be overheard by Zara's supporters, creating an uncomfortable tension in the gate area, as two very different narratives competed for dominance. Officer Kane found himself increasingly caught in the middle, realizing that his initial assessment of the situation had been completely wrong. The more he observed the dynamics at play, the more he understood that he'd been manipulated into supporting discriminatory behavior by a gate agent, who'd presented him with a biased version of events. Marcus Williams, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation, quietly interviewing passengers and reviewing documentation. As an African-American supervisor, he understood the delicate balance required to address discrimination complaints while maintaining operational efficiency. But the evidence was overwhelming. Victoria's behavior had been clearly problematic from the beginning. "Miss," Santos Marcus said, approaching Maria with professional courtesy, "could you walk me through what you observed from the beginning?" Maria looked nervously at Diego, who was coloring in a book she'd brought for the flight. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but what I saw wasn't right. Ma'am, getting people in trouble isn't the goal here. Understanding what happened is. Your perspective as a witness could be very important." Maria took a deep breath and began recounting the events she'd observed, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. From the moment that young woman approached the counter, the gate agent treated her differently than she treated the other passengers. When the scanner confirmed her ticket, instead of apologizing for the confusion, she doubled down and insisted there must be an error. "And what was your impression of the passenger's behavior throughout this interaction?" "She was polite, patient, and respectful, even when she was being treated badly. She tried every reasonable approach to resolve the situation before it escalated." Marcus nodded, making notes on his tablet. "Thank you. Would you be willing to provide a formal written statement about what you observed? If it helps make sure this doesn't happen to someone else, yes." Rebecca Walsh had been listening to the conversation and stepped forward. "I'd like to provide a statement as well. As an educator, I've been trained to recognize bullying behavior, and what I witnessed tonight was a textbook example of an authority figure abusing their position to target someone they perceived as vulnerable." Victoria Blackwood, overhearing these conversations, felt her panic rising. The narrative was solidifying against her, with multiple credible witnesses documenting behavior that clearly violated company policies. Her attempts to control the situation had only made things worse. She approached Marcus desperately. "Marcus, you know me. You know I'm not discriminatory. This is all being blown out of proportion by passengers who don't understand airline security protocols." Marcus looked at Victoria with a mixture of disappointment and professional obligation. "Victoria, I've been watching the videos that passengers posted. I've talked to witnesses. I've reviewed the boarding documentation. What protocols were you following when you continued to question a passenger after your own system confirmed their reservation?" Victoria fumbled for an answer that would justify her behavior without admitting to the prejudice that had motivated it. "Sometimes the system has errors. I was just being thorough." "Thorough about what, specifically? What additional verification did you attempt before calling security?" The question trapped Victoria because the honest answer that she'd made assumptions based entirely on appearance would confirm everything her critics were saying about her motivations. Meanwhile, Captain Sarah Thompson had arrived at the gate to begin her pre-flight briefings. At 41, Sarah was one of Elite Airways' most experienced pilots, known for her professionalism and calm judgment. She'd been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years and had seen her share of boarding disputes, but the crowd gathered around Gate A7 was unlike anything in her experience. "What's the situation here?" Sarah asked Marcus quietly. "Gate agent denied boarding to a confirmed first-class passenger based on appearance. Multiple witnesses, social media documentation, and unfortunately the passenger in question appears to be David Mitchell's daughter." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "The CEO's daughter and Victoria denied her boarding." "That's correct. And it gets worse, she called airport security and attempted to have the passenger arrested for fraud." Sarah looked around the gate area, taking in the clear divisions among passengers and the obvious tension radiating from Victoria. "Where's the passenger now?" Marcus pointed to Zara, who was standing calmly in the center of her group of supporters, checking her phone for updates from her father. Sarah walked over to introduce herself. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Captain Thompson. I'll be flying you to New York tonight, and I want to apologize for what you've experienced here. This is not how Elite Airways passengers should be treated." "Thank you," Captain Zara replied. "I appreciate that, but I'm hoping this can lead to changes that help other passengers too. I don't want special treatment because of who my father is. I want fair treatment because it's right." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude. And I want you to know that from a crew perspective, we take discrimination complaints very seriously. What happened here tonight will not be forgotten or ignored." The conversation was interrupted by Preston Montgomery, who approached the group with obvious agitation. "Captain Thompson, I hope you realize that this entire situation has been manufactured by passengers who are looking for problems where none exist. I've been flying Elite Airways for years, and I've never seen anything like this disruption." Sarah looked at Preston with a professional politeness, masking obvious displeasure. "Sir, I've reviewed the documentation that passengers have provided, and I've spoken with our operations supervisor. What I see is a legitimate passenger who was discriminated against by our staff and then supported by fellow travelers who recognized injustice when they saw it." Preston flushed red. "That's a very politically correct interpretation, but it's the correct interpretation," Sarah interrupted firmly. "And as the pilot in command of this aircraft, I'm responsible for ensuring that all passengers are treated with equal dignity and respect." The exchange was witnessed by dozens of passengers, many of whom were recording on their phones. Preston realized he was being documented supporting discrimination in real time, with the pilot publicly contradicting his version of events. But before the situation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the conversation from the edge of the crowd. "Excuse me," the voice said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "I believe there's been some confusion here that needs to be cleared up." Everyone turned toward the source of the voice, and Victoria Blackwood felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. David Mitchell stood at the edge of the crowd, dressed casually in khakis and a button-down shirt, looking like any other traveler. But his presence immediately changed the entire dynamic in the gate area. The CEO had arrived. David Mitchell had been standing on the periphery of the crowd for nearly 10 minutes, watching and listening as the drama unfolded around Gate A7. He'd positioned himself behind a support pillar where he could observe without being immediately recognized, wanting to see how his employees and passengers behaved when they thought no one important was watching. What he witnessed made him both furious and proud in equal measure. He watched Victoria Blackwood continue to defend her indefensible actions, doubling down on discrimination rather than admitting fault. He saw Preston Montgomery rally support for prejudice among passengers who preferred authority to justice. But he also saw strangers, Maria Santos, James Rodriguez, Rebecca Walsh, risk their own comfort to stand up for his daughter because it was the right thing to do. David pulled out his phone and began recording his own video, documenting the aftermath of the initial confrontation. He wanted a complete record of how his staff handled the situation when they thought there would be no consequences for their actions. "This is David Mitchell, CEO of Elite Airways," he said quietly into his phone camera. "I'm currently observing a situation at Gate A7 where my daughter has been denied boarding by my own staff based solely on her appearance. What you're about to see is how discrimination perpetuates itself when people in authority positions believe they won't be held accountable." He panned the camera across the crowd, capturing Victoria's defensive body language, Marcus Williams's professional investigation, and the clear divisions among passengers. But most importantly, he captured his daughter's grace under pressure, her ability to maintain composure while surrounded by conflict. Marcus Williams noticed the man with the phone standing near the pillar and approached cautiously. Something about the stranger seemed familiar, but Marcus couldn't immediately place him. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said politely. "Are you a passenger on tonight's flight?" David looked up from his phone with a slight smile. "You could say that I have a vested interest in this flight." Marcus studied David's face more carefully. There was something about the stranger's bearing, his confidence, his way of observing the situation with analytical detachment that seemed significant. "Have we met before?" Marcus asked. "We have," David replied, "though not under these circumstances." Recognition dawned in Marcus's eyes like a sunrise. "Mr. Mitchell." "Hello, Marcus. I appreciate the professional way you've been handling this situation." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The CEO had been watching the entire aftermath, observing how his employees responded to discrimination complaints. Everything Marcus had said and done in the past 20 minutes had been under the scrutiny of the man who could make or end his career. "Sir, I want you to know that I've been conducting a thorough investigation of the incident, and I've documented clear violations of our customer service protocols." David nodded approvingly. "I've been watching Marcus. Your professionalism in a difficult situation has been noted. Should I inform Miss Blackwood that you're here?" David glanced toward Victoria, who was still arguing with witnesses and trying to justify her actions. "Not yet. I want to see how she handles this when she thinks there are no consequences for her behavior." Marcus understood immediately. This was a test of character, and Victoria was failing it spectacularly. "Sir, what about your daughter?" "Zara is handling herself beautifully," David said with obvious pride. "She doesn't need me to rescue her. But she deserves to see that her father's company will hold people accountable when they violate our values." David continued to observe as Captain Thompson arrived and immediately began apologizing to Zara for the treatment she'd received. He watched Preston Montgomery attempt to argue with the pilot about the legitimacy of discrimination complaints. He saw his daughter maintain her dignity while surrounded by people who were turning her trauma into entertainment. But what struck him most was the community that had formed around Zara. These strangers had no obligation to help her, no personal stake in the outcome, but they'd chosen to stand up because they recognized injustice. They'd created a support network that protected his daughter when she was vulnerable and amplified her voice when others tried to silence her. Marcus David said quietly, "I want you to get contact information from every passenger who supported my daughter tonight. I want to personally thank them, and I want to make sure they know that their courage didn't go unnoticed." "Already in progress, sir." David's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. "Situation has reached national news. CNN just picked up the story. Social media engagement approaching viral levels. Board wants immediate statement." He typed back, "Board gets a statement when the situation is resolved properly, not before." Another text arrived, this one from his communications director. "Legal department recommends limited response to minimize liability exposure." David's response was immediate. "Legal department needs to understand that doing the right thing is more important than limiting liability. We fix this properly, or we don't fix it at all." As he watched the ongoing conversation between his daughter and Captain Thompson, David felt a deep sense of clarity about what needed to happen next. This wasn't just about resolving one incident. It was about defining what Elite Airways stood for when principles were tested under pressure. He noticed Victoria approaching Marcus again, clearly growing more desperate as she realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. "Marcus, you have to help me here," Victoria pleaded. "These passengers are making this into something it's not. This girl is obviously not our typical first-class demographic, and I was just following standard verification procedures." David stepped closer, wanting to hear Victoria's defense of her actions. "What standard procedures?" Marcus asked patiently. "What specific protocols did you follow after the scanner confirmed her reservation?" "I used my professional judgment to assess whether the passenger met our service standards," Victoria replied, apparently believing this was a legitimate justification. "And what specific standards was she failing to meet?" Victoria gestured at Zara's appearance. "Look at her. Does she look like someone who belongs in first class? I've been doing this job for years, and I know how to spot problems." David felt his jaw clench as he listened to Victoria explicitly confirm that her behavior had been motivated by appearance-based discrimination. She wasn't even trying to deny it, she was defending it as appropriate professional conduct. "So, your assessment was based entirely on visual observation," Marcus continued. "Of course. You can tell a lot about people by how they present themselves." David had heard enough. He stepped forward from behind the pillar, his movement catching Marcus's attention. "Miss Blackwood," David said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed gate area. "Could you explain to me exactly what you mean by people like that?" Victoria turned toward the voice, not immediately recognizing the casually dressed man who'd just joined the conversation. Her irritation at being interrupted by another passenger was evident in her expression. "Excuse me, sir, but this is airline business. Passengers need to remain in the designated waiting areas while we resolve operational issues. David smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I think you'll find that this very much is my business, Miss Blackwood. Something in his tone made Victoria pause. There was an authority in his voice that didn't match his casual appearance, a confidence that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. Marcus stepped forward. Miss Blackwood, I'd like you to meet. But David held up a hand, stopping the introduction. He wanted Victoria to continue defending discrimination without the knowledge that she was talking to the CEO. He wanted to see exactly who she was when she thought there were no consequences for her prejudice. Please continue explaining your assessment process, David said to Victoria. I'm very interested in understanding how you determine which passengers belong in first class. Victoria, still not recognizing David, but sensing something significant in the conversation, began to feel genuinely nervous for the first time that evening. And in that moment of growing awareness that she was no longer in control of the situation, Victoria Blackwood began to understand that her career in the airline industry was about to come to a very abrupt end. David Mitchell stepped fully into the circle of passengers and staff gathered around Gate A7, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the space. Though he was dressed casually and had approached quietly, there was something unmistakably authoritative about his bearing that made conversations pause and heads turn. Victoria Blackwood looked at him with a growing irritation, still not recognizing the man who was about to change her life forever. In her world, authority came with suits and titles and obvious displays of wealth. This casually dressed stranger didn't fit her mental model of someone who mattered. Sir, I've already explained that this is an operational matter, Victoria said with strained patience. Passengers need to remain in the designated seating areas while we resolve this boarding issue. David studied Victoria's face carefully, noting the way her professional mask had been replaced by barely contained frustration and defensiveness. This was a woman who'd clearly never been challenged successfully before, someone accustomed to intimidating passengers into compliance through sheer force of personality. I'm not here as a passenger, David replied calmly. I'm here because I'm concerned about the treatment I've been observing. Concerned Victoria's voice took on an edge. Sir, what you've been observing is standard security protocol. We have procedures for dealing with questionable documentation and questionable how David interrupted gently. I've been watching for the past 15 minutes, and from what I've observed, your scanner confirmed the passenger's reservation and status. What made the documentation questionable after that confirmation? Victoria felt a chill of unease. This stranger was asking the same pointed questions that Marcus had been asking, the same questions that the other passengers had been asking. Questions that forced her to confront the real reasons for her behavior. The passenger profile didn't match our first-class standards, Victoria replied, falling back on the explanation she'd been using all evening. What standards specifically? David pressed. Are there written policies about passenger appearance, dress codes for boarding, specific requirements beyond having a valid ticket? Preston Montgomery, who'd been watching this new confrontation develop, stepped forward with obvious irritation. Look, friend, I don't know who you think you are, but you're interfering with airline personnel trying to do their jobs. David turned his attention to Preston, taking in the expensive suit, the obvious entitlement, the assumption that his intervention would be welcomed by staff. I think there's been a misunderstanding about who's doing their job and who's failing to do theirs, David replied mildly. From what I've observed, a passenger with valid documentation has been harassed and threatened with arrest based solely on appearance. That doesn't sound like anyone doing their job correctly. Preston's face flushed red. That girl was clearly trying to scam her way into first class. Anyone with eyes could see she didn't belong there, based on what David asked. Her clothing, her age, her race. The direct question hung in the air like an accusation. Preston sputtered, realizing he'd been maneuvered into revealing his actual motivations. It's not about race, Preston protested. It's about standards, about maintaining order, about people knowing their place. Their place, David repeated softly. And who determines where someone's place is Mr. Montgomery, Preston Montgomery III. And I determine my place through hard work and success, not by demanding handouts or special treatment. David nodded thoughtfully. And you've determined that young woman's place based on what information exactly? Her achievement, her work ethic, her character. I've determined it based on obvious facts, Preston replied, his voice rising. Look at her. Look at how she's dressed. Look at the chaos she's created by refusing to accept reality. Zara had been listening to this exchange in growing amazement. This stranger was methodically dismantling every argument that had been used against her, forcing her critics to confront the prejudices behind their positions. But there was something familiar about his approach, something that reminded her of Dad. Zara called out uncertainly. David looked over at his daughter with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. The cold, analytical expression he'd been wearing while questioning Victoria and Preston melted into pure paternal warmth. "Hello, sweetheart," David said simply. The two words hit the gate area like a bomb blast. Victoria's face went white. Preston took a step backward as if he'd been physically struck. Officer Kane, who'd been hovering uncertainly on the edges of the group, suddenly understood why everyone had been treating this situation as if it was about to explode. Marcus Williams felt a mixture of relief and vindication. The CEO had been watching everything, had seen the professional way Marcus had handled the investigation, had witnessed firsthand the discrimination that Marcus had documented. Maria Santos smiled broadly. "Well," she said to Diego, "I think things are about to get very interesting." James Rodriguez lowered his phone, which had been recording the entire exchange. "This is going to be one hell of a story," he muttered. Rebecca Walsh felt a surge of satisfaction. She'd stood up for what was right, and now it was clear that the young woman she'd defended was the daughter of the man who could actually change things. But Victoria Blackwood felt only terror. Every word she'd spoken, every assumption she'd made, every discriminatory action she'd taken had been witnessed by the CEO whose daughter she'd been harassing. Her career wasn't just over, it was destroyed. David walked over to Zara and embraced her gently. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said quietly, "but I'm proud of how you handled yourself. Dad, you didn't need to." "Yes, I did," David interrupted firmly. "Some things are more important than board meetings." He turned back to face Victoria Preston and Officer Kane, his expression returning to cold professionalism. "Now," David said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the suddenly silent gate area, "I think we need to have a conversation about accountability consequences and what it really means to represent Elite Airways with integrity." The reckoning had begun. David Mitchell stood in the center of the gate area like a judge preparing to deliver verdicts, his casual appearance completely at odds with the authority radiating from his presence. The crowd of passengers, staff, and security personnel formed a natural circle around him, everyone understanding instinctively that they were about to witness something significant. Miss Blackwood David began, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I'd like you to walk me through your decision-making process this evening, starting from the moment my daughter approached your counter." Victoria Blackwood felt like she was drowning in slow motion. Every word she'd spoken, every assumption she'd made was about to be dissected by the one person who could end her career with a single decision. But she was trapped. Admitting fault would be professional suicide, but continuing to defend her actions meant doubling down on discrimination in front of the CEO. Mr. Mitchell, Victoria began, her voice shaking slightly. There was a boarding situation that required additional verification due to unusual circumstances. "What circumstances specifically?" David interrupted. "Please be precise." Victoria glanced around the circle of faces, watching her, looking for support that wasn't coming. Even Preston Montgomery had stepped back, suddenly reluctant to be associated with her defense. The passenger's appearance didn't match the typical profile for a first-class cabin, Victoria said, immediately realizing how terrible that sounded. "Our typical profile," David repeated. "Miss Blackwood, could you describe for everyone here what you believe constitutes our typical first-class profile?" The question was a trap, and Victoria knew it. Any answer would reveal the prejudices that had motivated her behavior. But David's steady gaze and the expectant silence of the crowd demanded a response. Well-dressed business people, usually older professionals who who present themselves appropriately for the premium cabin experience, Victoria fumbled. I see, David said. And in your professional judgment, how did my daughter fail to meet these presentation standards? Marcus Williams had his tablet out documenting every word of the conversation. As the designated supervisor, it was his responsibility to create an official record of the investigation, but he was also fascinated to watch a master class in how to conduct an accountability conversation. Sir, she was dressed very casually, almost like a student. And she is a student, David interrupted. A senior at Parsons School of Design. Does being a student disqualify someone from first-class service? No, sir. But, and her casual dress. Are you saying Elite Airways has a dress code for passengers? Victoria realized she was being backed into a corner with each question. Not an official dress code, but we maintain certain standards. Whose standards? David pressed. Company standards. Your personal standards. Industry standards. Please be specific about whose authority you were representing when you made these judgments. Officer Kane shifted uncomfortably, beginning to understand that he'd been manipulated into supporting a discriminatory action that had no basis in actual policy or procedure. I was using my professional experience and judgment, Victoria replied weakly. Your professional judgment, David repeated. Miss Blackwood. In your professional experience, how many times have you required additional verification from passengers whose tickets scanned successfully? The question caught Victoria off guard. She'd never been asked to quantify her verification requests before, and the answer would reveal the pattern of her behavior. I don't have exact numbers. Approximately. Once a week, once a month, daily. It depends on the circumstances, Victoria hedged. Let's talk about those circumstances, David continued. Marcus, do you have access to passenger complaint records? Marcus nodded and began scrolling through his tablet. Yes, sir. I can pull up complaint summaries for the past 6 months. Please read any complaint specifically mentioning Miss Blackwood's name. Marcus's expression grew serious as he found the relevant records. Sir, there are several. Gate agent questioned my right to be in first class despite confirmed reservation. Was made to feel unwelcome and suspected of fraud. Agent seemed surprised that someone who looked like me had a first-class ticket. David's jaw tightened as he listened to the summary of complaints. Each one painted a picture of discriminatory behavior that had been allowed to continue unchecked. How many complaints total? David asked. 14 formal complaints in 6 months, sir, all following a similar pattern. The number hit the crowd like a revelation. This wasn't an isolated incident or a misunderstanding. It was a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been documented but apparently not addressed. James Rodriguez, who'd been recording the entire conversation, spoke up. Sir, I'm a retired military pilot with 30 years of flying experience. What I witnessed tonight wasn't professional judgment. It was profiling, pure and simple. David nodded appreciatively. Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for your service and for speaking up tonight. Your intervention was noted and appreciated. He turned back to Victoria. Miss Blackwood, given this pattern of complaints, how do you explain your continued employment with Elite Airways? Victoria felt trapped. She'd never been directly confronted about the complaints before they'd apparently been filed and forgotten, with no meaningful consequences for her behavior. I wasn't aware of any pattern, Victoria lied. Individual complaints can be misunderstandings or miscommunications. 14. Misunderstandings in 6 months, David said dryly, all involving passengers who felt discriminated against by your appearance-based judgments. Miss Blackwood, do you see a pattern there? Preston Montgomery, who'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation revealed the extent of Victoria's discriminatory behavior, finally tried to distance himself from his earlier support. Look, I may have been hasty in my initial assessment, Preston began. These situations can be confusing, and Mr. Montgomery David interrupted, turning his attention to Preston with the same cold, analytical gaze. You weren't hasty. You were actively supportive of discriminatory treatment. You told my daughter to go to her assigned section and let the adults board. You questioned whether someone who looked like her could afford a first-class seat. Your behavior tonight wasn't confusion, It was conscious choice to support prejudice. Preston's face flushed red. I was just supporting proper procedures. No, Rebecca Walsh interrupted, stepping forward. You were supporting discrimination because it didn't affect you personally. I was sitting right there and I heard every word you said. You weren't confused, you were cruel. Maria Santos nodded in agreement. My son was listening to everything you said. You were teaching him that some people matter less than others based on how they look. Preston found himself surrounded by hostile faces, passengers who'd witnessed his behavior and were no longer willing to let him rewrite the narrative. This is ridiculous, Preston sputtered. I refuse to be lectured by whom? David asked quietly. By passengers who witnessed your behavior, by staff documenting your actions, by the CEO whose daughter you helped humiliate. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Preston realized that his comfortable assumption that wealth and status would protect him from consequences was about to be tested. Captain Thompson, who'd been watching the investigation unfold, stepped forward to address David directly. Sir, as the pilot in command for this flight, I want to formally apologize for the treatment your daughter received from our staff. This is not reflective of Elite Airways values, and I take personal responsibility for ensuring it doesn't happen again. Thank you, Captain David replied. Your professionalism and immediate response to correct this situation have been noted. However, I think we need to acknowledge that this isn't just about one employee's bad judgment. This is about a culture that allowed discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked despite multiple formal complaints. Marcus Williams cleared his throat nervously. Sir, I want to take responsibility for not addressing the pattern of complaints more aggressively. The complaints were filed, but follow-up training and corrective action should have been implemented earlier. David studied Marcus carefully. The supervisor was taking accountability rather than making excuses, which spoke well of his character and leadership potential. Marcus, I appreciate your honesty, but I'm more interested in solutions than blame assignment. What recommendations would you make for preventing similar incidents in the future? Marcus straightened, understanding that he was being tested on his ability to think beyond the immediate crisis. Sir, I recommend mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, revised complaint procedures that require supervisor review within 24 hours, and customer feedback monitoring that flags patterns of discriminatory treatment. Additionally, I think we need clear consequences for staff who violate our dignity and respect policies. Excellent recommendations, David said approvingly. Consider yourself in charge of implementing those changes across all terminal operations. Victoria watched this exchange with growing despair, understanding that her replacement was being selected and promoted in real time, while she stood there awaiting the announcement of her termination. But David wasn't finished with his investigation. He turned to Officer Kane, who'd been standing quietly throughout the conversation, clearly hoping to avoid attention. Officer Kane, David said, I'm curious about your role in this situation. When you arrived, what specific information led you to believe that criminal charges were appropriate? Kane felt his stomach drop. He'd acted entirely on Victoria's word without conducting any independent investigation, and now he was about to be held accountable for that failure. The reckoning was far from over. Officer Kane stood frozen under David Mitchell's steady gaze, realizing that his career in airport security was about to be evaluated by the one person who could have him permanently barred from the industry. The casual way he'd accepted Victoria's version of events without investigation was about to be exposed as professional negligence. Officer Kane, David, continued, his voice maintaining its calm but implacable tone. When you responded to this call, what specific evidence of criminal activity did you observe? Kane glanced around the circle of faces, watching him, looking for support that wasn't coming. Even Victoria had stepped back, apparently realizing that her only chance of minimizing her own destruction was to distance herself from the security officer she'd manipulated into supporting her discrimination. Ma'am, Miss Blackwood informed me that there was a passenger attempting to board with fraudulent documentation, Kane replied weakly. Did you verify that claim independently? David asked. I relied on the gate agent's professional assessment of the situation. without looking at the documentation yourself, without checking the computer system, without interviewing witnesses. Each question hit Kane like a physical blow, exposing the complete inadequacy of his response. He'd acted like Victoria's enforcer rather than an independent investigator, and everyone in the gate area now understood how easily he'd been manipulated. Sir, gate agents are trained to identify fraudulent documents, and Officer Kane James Rodriguez interrupted. I informed you that I had video evidence contradicting the gate agent's claims. Did you review that evidence before threatening to arrest Miss Mitchell? Kane's face flushed red. I was responding to an active situation. You were responding to an accusation of criminal activity without bothering to investigate whether a crime had actually occurred, Rebecca Walsh added firmly. That's not law enforcement, that's harassment. Maria Santos stepped forward, her voice quiet, but carrying the authority of someone who'd worked with law enforcement through her job as a nurse. Officer, I've seen real crimes. I've worked with police officers who take their responsibility to seek truth seriously. What you did tonight wasn't police work. It was bullying on behalf of someone else's prejudices. David watched the methodical dismantling of Kane's position with satisfaction. The officer had failed every basic standard of professional conduct, and the witnesses to his failure were making sure everyone understood the implications. Officer Kane David said finally, I'll be filing a formal complaint with airport security about your handling of this incident. Your supervisor will be receiving a detailed report about your failure to conduct even basic investigatory procedures before threatening a passenger with arrest. Kane realized that his career in security was effectively over. Word would spread quickly through the industry that he'd threatened to arrest a CEO's daughter based on false accusations he'd never bothered to verify. But David's attention had already moved on. He turned to face the crowd of passengers who'd been watching the entire confrontation unfold, many of whom were still recording on their phones. Ladies and gentlemen, David announced, I want to thank those of you who spoke up for my daughter tonight. Mr. Rodriguez, Miss Santos, Miss Walsh. Your courage in the face of injustice represents the best of human nature. You had no obligation to get involved, but you chose to stand up for what was right. The three passengers exchanged glances, each feeling a mixture of pride and relief that their intervention had been vindicated. However, David continued, I also want to address those of you who supported discriminatory treatment, either actively or through silence. What happened here tonight isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of cultural attitudes that allow prejudice to flourish when people believe there will be no consequences for their actions. Preston Montgomery felt every eye in the gate area turned toward him. His earlier confidence had been replaced by the growing realization that his behavior had been documented and would likely follow him far beyond this airport terminal. Mr. Montgomery, David said, addressing him directly, you actively encouraged discriminatory treatment of my daughter. You questioned her right to be in first class based solely on her appearance. You dismissed her as entitled and suggested she didn't belong among adults. Do you stand by those statements? Preston felt trapped. Backing down would look like cowardice, but doubling down would mean defending obvious discrimination in front of the CEO and dozens of witnesses. I may have misread the situation, Preston said weakly. You didn't misread anything. Zara spoke for the first time since her father's arrival, her voice clear and strong. You saw exactly what you expected to see a young black woman who you assumed didn't belong in first class. The only thing you misread was whether there would be consequences for your prejudice. Her words hit Preston like a slap. Coming from the young woman he'd dismissed and demeaned, they carried more weight than any accusations from her father. You could have said nothing, Zara continued. You could have minded your own business, but you chose to actively support discrimination because it made you feel superior. That says everything about your character. Preston found himself speechless, facing the accusation from someone he'd helped humiliate while surrounded by passengers who'd witnessed his behavior. David felt immense pride watching his daughter confront her tormentor with such grace and power. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was demanding accountability and recognition of the harm that had been done. Miss Blackwood David said, turning to Victoria for what everyone understood would be her final evaluation. "Do you have anything you'd like to say before I make my decision about your continued employment?" Victoria looked around the circle of faces one more time, searching for any possibility of redemption or mercy. But she found only the consequences of her own actions staring back at her. Mr. Mitchell Victoria began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to apologize for my treatment of your daughter. I made assumptions that were inappropriate and unprofessional." "Inappropriate and unprofessional," David repeated. "Miss Blackwood, you subjected my daughter to harassment, humiliation, and threats of arrest based solely on your racial prejudices. You ignored your own computer system's verification in favor of your personal biases. You escalated a non-existent problem into a crisis that required security intervention. And according to the records Marcus provided, this was the 14th time in 6 months you've subjected passengers to similar treatment." Victoria felt the weight of every decision she'd made that evening crushing down on her. Each choice to escalate rather than de-escalate, each assumption based on appearance rather than facts, each moment when she'd chosen prejudice over professionalism had led inevitably to this moment of reckoning. "I understand that my judgment was flawed," Victoria said desperately, "but I believe I can learn from this experience and improve my performance." "No," David interrupted firmly. "You can't learn from this experience as an Elite Airways employee because you no longer work for Elite Airways. You're terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct, discriminatory behavior, and violation of our fundamental values. Security will escort you from the premises, and you'll be permanently barred from all Elite Airways facilities." The words fell like a gavel, final and irrevocable. Victoria's career in the airline industry was over-destroyed by her own prejudices and poor judgment. But David wasn't finished. He turned to Preston Montgomery with the same cold determination. "Mr. Montgomery, you're banned from flying on Elite Airways or any of our partner airlines. Your behavior tonight demonstrated that you're incompatible with our commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect." Preston's face went white. Being banned from major airlines would severely impact his ability to travel for business, effectively damaging his career prospects. "You can't do this," Preston protested. "I'm a Platinum member. I spend thousands of dollars with your airline." "You're a former Platinum member," David corrected. "Money doesn't buy the right to harass other passengers. Your membership is revoked permanently." The swift, decisive consequences sent a clear message to everyone watching. Discrimination would not be tolerated regardless of who perpetrated it or what their status had been. David looked around the gate area one more time, his eyes settling on his daughter, who stood surrounded by the strangers who'd become her allies. Sometimes, David said quietly, it takes a crisis to reveal who people really are when they think no one important is watching. Tonight, I learned exactly who my employees and passengers are when they believe there are no consequences for their choices. The investigation was complete. Justice had been swift and decisive. Now came the consequences. The transformation in the gate area was immediate and electric. Victoria Blackwood stood frozen in shock, the reality of her termination hitting her like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed professional persona crumbled as the weight of losing everything she'd worked for settled over her. "Security to Gate A7. David said into his phone, calling for an escort to remove Victoria from the premises. "Employee termination and property removal required." Victoria's hands shook as she processed the finality of her situation. "Mr. Mitchell, please, I have a mortgage car payments. I've been with the company for 2 years without any major incidents. 14 complaints in 6 months is not without major incidents," David replied firmly. "It's a pattern of discriminatory behavior that should have been addressed months ago. Your employment ends now." Marcus Williams stepped forward with a tablet and official forms. "Miss Blackwood, I'll need your company ID access cards and any company property. HR will contact you about final pay and benefits termination." The administrative efficiency of her destruction was almost surreal. Within minutes, Victoria had gone from a position of authority to being escorted from the building like a security risk. Preston Montgomery, meanwhile, was frantically scrolling through his phone, trying to understand the implications of being permanently banned from Elite Airways and its partner airlines. "This is insane," Preston muttered to himself, then looked up at David with desperate indignation. "You're destroying my ability to travel for business because of one misunderstanding." One misunderstanding. Maria Santos stepped forward, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You actively supported discrimination against that young woman. You told her to go to the back of the bus, essentially. That wasn't a misunderstanding, that was prejudice." James Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "Sir, I recorded everything you said. Your comments about her not belonging, about her looking like she was hoping for extra peanuts, about knowing her place, that wasn't confusion. That was deliberate cruelty." Preston found himself surrounded by hostile faces, passengers who'd witnessed his behavior and were no longer willing to let him minimize his actions. "I was supporting what I thought were proper procedures," Preston protested weakly. "No," Rebecca Walsh said firmly. "You were supporting discrimination because it didn't affect you personally. You saw someone being treated badly and decided to make it worse because you thought it was safe to do so." David watched this confrontation with satisfaction. The passengers who'd supported his daughter were now holding Preston accountable without any prompting, creating a community response to prejudice that would be far more powerful than any corporate policy. "Mr. Montgomery," David said, "your ban is permanent and non-negotiable. If you want to understand why, I suggest you watch the videos that passengers recorded tonight. Perhaps seeing your own behavior from the outside will provide the clarity that seems to be missing from your self-assessment." Captain Thompson, who'd been observing the proceedings with professional interest, stepped forward to address the operational implications of what had just happened. "Sir, we need to proceed with boarding if we're going to make our slot to New York. The crew is ready, and we're already running behind schedule." David nodded approvingly. "Absolutely, Captain. My daughter has been delayed long enough by this nonsense. Let's get everyone on board who deserves to be there." Zara stepped forward, looking around at the faces of the passengers who'd supported her. "Before we board, I want to thank everyone who spoke up tonight. You didn't have to get involved, but you chose to stand up for what was right. That meant more to me than you'll ever know." Maria Santos smiled and gave Zara a quick hug. "Mija, we stick together. That's how things change for the better." James Rodriguez shook hands with both Zara and David. "Sir, your daughter handled herself with remarkable grace tonight." "You should be proud." "I am," David replied. "But I'm also grateful to you and the others who showed that courage and decency still exist when people are tested." Rebecca Walsh approached with her phone out. "I hope it's okay that I recorded parts of tonight. This story needs to be shared not for entertainment but for education. People need to see what discrimination looks like and how a community can respond to it. Please share it," David said. "Sunlight is the best disinfectant for this kind of behavior." Officer Kane, realizing that his role in the evening's events was far from over, approached David hesitantly. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to apologize for my handling of this situation. I should have investigated the claims more thoroughly before threatening arrest." David studied Kane's face, noting the genuine remorse but also understanding that good intentions couldn't excuse professional negligence. "Officer Kane, your supervisor will be receiving a detailed report about tonight's events. Whether you continue in airport security will depend on his assessment of your judgment and professionalism. I suggest you use this as a learning experience about the importance of independent investigation rather than blind deference to authority." Kane nodded glumly, understanding that his career in security was probably over regardless of what his supervisor ultimately decided. As airport security arrived to escort Victoria from the premises, she made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her career. "This isn't fair," Victoria protested as the officers flanked her. "I was just doing my job the way I was trained to do it." "No," Marcus Williams replied firmly. "You were doing your prejudices and calling it your job. The training you received emphasized treating all passengers with dignity and respect. You chose to ignore that training in favor of your personal biases." Victoria was escorted away from Gate A7 with all the ceremony of a criminal being arrested, her dramatic fall from authority to exile witnessed by dozens of passengers who were documenting her departure on their phones. Preston Montgomery, meanwhile, was gathering his expensive luggage while muttering about lawsuits and discrimination against wealthy passengers. But his threats rang hollow. He'd been caught on video actively supporting discrimination, and no lawyer would want to argue that wealth should protect prejudice from consequences. "This isn't over," Preston said to no one in particular as he wheeled his bags toward the exit. "Yes, it is," Zara replied quietly. "It's completely over." David felt a surge of pride at his daughter's quiet confidence. She'd been through a traumatic experience but had emerged stronger, surrounded by allies, and vindicated in her belief that justice was possible when people were willing to fight for it. Captain Thompson began the boarding process with obvious relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now ready to begin boarding for Flight EA 707 to New York. We'll start with first class and elite members." Zara approached the podium with her boarding pass, the same piece of paper that had started the entire confrontation. But this time there was no question about her right to be there, no assumptions about her worthiness, no barriers between her and the seat she'd legitimately purchased. "Welcome aboard, Miss Mitchell," Captain Thompson said warmly. "I hope the rest of your journey is far more pleasant than what you experienced here tonight." "Thank you, Captain. I have a feeling it will be." As Zara walked down the jetway toward the aircraft, followed by her father and the passengers who'd supported her, the gate area slowly emptied of the drama that had defined the past hour. The overnight cleaning crew began their routine work, but the impact of what had happened would ripple far beyond the physical space. Social media was already exploding with videos, commentary, and debate about the night's events. News outlets were picking up the story. Corporate communications teams were scrambling to craft responses. But in the quiet of the nearly empty gate area, the real impact was simpler and more profound. A young woman had been treated with dignity after being denied it. A community had formed around justice, and consequences had been swift and meaningful for those who chose prejudice over principle. The plane was ready to depart, carrying Zara home to New York for New Year's Eve. But more importantly, it was carrying the proof that when people choose courage over convenience, justice remains possible even in an imperfect world. Flight EA 707 settled into its cruising altitude over the desert landscape of Arizona, leaving the chaos of Phoenix Sky Harbor far below. In the first-class cabin, an unusual sense of community had developed among passengers who'd shared an experience none of them would ever forget. Zara Mitchell sat in seat 2A, the same seat that had sparked the entire confrontation with her father beside her in 2B, but the premium cabin felt different now. What should have been a sanctuary of privilege and exclusion had become a space where justice had been demonstrated, and relationships had been forged across lines that usually divided people. "How are you feeling?" David asked, quietly studying his daughter's face for signs of the trauma she'd endured. Exhausted, Zara admitted, but also oddly hopeful. "Tonight was horrible, but it also showed me that there are people willing to stand up for what's right even when it's inconvenient." Across the aisle, in seats 3A and 3B, Maria Santos was helping her son Diego with a coloring book while reflecting on the evening's events. When Captain Thompson had invited her and Diego to move to first class, as guests of the airline, Maria had initially protested that they didn't belong there. Tonight proved that belonging isn't about what you're wearing or how much money you have, the captain had replied. It's about treating people with dignity. You earned your place here by standing up for someone who needed support. Now, watching Diego color contentedly in surroundings far more luxurious than their original economy seats, Maria felt a deep satisfaction. She'd taught her son an important lesson about courage and justice, and she'd discovered her own voice in the process. Mommy Diego said in Spanish, "Why was that lady so mean to the nice girl Maria considered how to explain prejudice to a 6-year-old? Sometimes Micho people make judgments about others based on how they look instead of who they really are. It's wrong, but it happens. The important thing is that we don't stay silent when we see it. Like you did tonight, like I did tonight. James Rodriguez had been upgraded to seat 4A as a gesture of appreciation from the airline. As a retired military pilot, he'd flown in first class before, but never as a reward for standing up to injustice. He was currently reviewing the videos on his phone, watching the confrontation unfold from multiple angles captured by different passengers. "Sir," he called to David, "I've been looking at these recordings and I think you should see how this is playing out online." David moved to the empty seat beside James to review the social media response. The videos were spreading rapidly across platforms with hashtags like Elite Airways discrimination and dignity can't be bought trending nationally. "It's remarkable," James said, scrolling through comments. People are sharing their own similar experiences, talking about times they witnessed discrimination but didn't speak up. "Your daughter seems to have started a broader conversation about bystander responsibility." David felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in how the situation had been handled, anger that it had been necessary, and determination to ensure lasting change. "James, I want you to know that your military service and your intervention tonight represent the best values of both institutions. Thank you for your courage." Rebecca Walsh, in seat 5A, was live streaming again, but this time to share the positive aftermath rather than document injustice. "This is what accountability looks like," she told her followers. "Swift, meaningful consequences for discriminatory behavior and recognition for those who stood up for justice." This young woman's father could have handled this quietly behind closed doors. Instead, he chose transparency and education. The comments on her stream were overwhelmingly positive, with teachers, parents, and civil rights advocates praising the clear demonstration of consequences for prejudice. Captain Thompson's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about an hour out from New York. I want to take a moment to address the events that delayed our departure tonight. What you witnessed was discrimination, and what you also witnessed was a community response that refused to tolerate it. I'm proud to be flying with passengers who choose courage over convenience." The announcement was met with applause throughout the cabin, but it also prompted deeper reflection among passengers who were considering their own roles as potential bystanders in future situations. David pulled out his laptop and began drafting a company-wide email that would be sent to all Elite Airways employees before the morning shift began. "What are you writing?" Zara asked. "A message about tonight, but also about the culture we're building going forward. This can't be a one-time response to a crisis. It has to be the beginning of sustained change." Zara read over her father's shoulder as he typed, "Tonight our company faced a test of our values. A passenger was subjected to discriminatory treatment by our staff, and that treatment was witnessed and documented by fellow travelers who chose to speak up for justice. The employee responsible has been terminated immediately. The passenger affected was my daughter, but that's not why consequences were swift. It's because discrimination is wrong regardless of who experiences it." Dad, Zara said softly, "Can I add something to that?" David handed her the laptop. Zara scrolled to the end of the draft and began typing, "I've traveled on Elite Airways my entire life, and I've seen the company my father built with the intention of treating every passenger with dignity. Tonight, I experienced the gap between intention and reality, but I also experienced the power of strangers who chose to support someone they didn't know because it was right. That's the culture we're building, one where silence in the face of injustice is not acceptable, and where courage is recognized and rewarded." David read his daughter's addition with growing admiration. "Perfect. But are you sure you want to be identified in a company communication? This will make you a public figure in ways you might not want." "I've been thinking about that," Zara replied. "What happened tonight is going viral anyway. I can either let other people control the narrative, or I can use my voice to make something positive come from a negative experience." The conversation was interrupted by Maria Santos, who approached their seats hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you," Maria said, "but I wanted to thank you both. Zara, watching you handle that situation with such grace gave me courage to speak up. And Mr. Mitchell seeing real consequences for discrimination gives me hope that things can actually change." David stood to face Maria directly. "Miss Santos, I want to offer you a position with Elite Airways as a customer experience consultant. Your willingness to intervene tonight, combined with your professional background as a nurse, suggests you understand how to treat people with dignity, even under pressure. Maria's eyes widened in surprise. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not qualified for corporate consulting. You're qualified by your character, David interrupted. Technical skills can be taught, but integrity and courage can't. Would you consider it? Maria looked at Diego, who was listening to the conversation with wide eyes, then back at David. Can I think about it and get back to you? Of course. Take all the time you need. As the plane began its descent toward New York, Zara felt a strange sense of closure about the evening's events. What had begun as humiliation and discrimination had ended with community justice and the promise of meaningful change. She looked around the first-class cabin at Maria and Diego, at James Rodriguez, at Rebecca Walsh, at the passengers who'd chosen to support her when she needed it most. This wasn't the isolated, privilege-protected space that first class usually represented. It was a community that had been forged through shared experience and moral courage. Dad Zara said, as the plane began its final approach to JFK, I think tonight changed more than just a few policies. I think it showed people what's possible when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal. David squeezed his daughter's hand. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd take from this experience. Justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create by our choices. As Flight EA 707 touched down at JFK Airport, carrying its passengers towards New Year's Eve, and new beginnings, the real impact of the night's events was just beginning to unfold across social media news outlets and the conversations of people who'd witnessed what accountability looked like when principles were tested under pressure. By the time Flight EA 707 touched down at JFK Airport, the story of Zara Mitchell's confrontation with elite Airways staff had exploded across social media platforms with the force of a cultural earthquake. The combination of clear video evidence, swift corporate justice, and the involvement of a CEO's family had created a perfect storm of viral engagement that was reshaping conversations about discrimination, privilege, and accountability in real time. James Rodriguez's original video had been viewed over 2 million times across multiple platforms. But more importantly, it had spawned thousands of response videos, commentary threads, and personal stories from people sharing their own experiences with discriminatory treatment while traveling. Dad, look at this, Zara said, scrolling through her phone as they disembarked the aircraft. People are calling it gate-us-even justice, and they're sharing stories from all over the country about similar experiences. David reviewed the trending hashtags on his phone, noting how quickly the conversation had evolved beyond just their specific incident. Elite Airways accountability was trending alongside bystander courage and traveling while black, creating a broader discussion about discrimination in the travel industry. But not all the coverage was positive. Conservative commentators and some social media influencers were framing the story as an example of cancel culture and reverse discrimination, arguing that Victoria Blackwood had been unfairly destroyed for making a reasonable professional judgment. How does this feel? Asked a reporter who'd been waiting at the gate, thrusting a microphone toward Zara as she entered the terminal. Becoming the face of airline discrimination overnight, David stepped protectively closer to his daughter, but Zara indicated she wanted to respond. I never wanted to become the face of anything, Zara replied thoughtfully. But if my experience helps other people understand what everyday discrimination looks like, and more importantly, how communities can respond to it, then something good comes from something terrible. What do you say to critics who argue that your father's position gave you unfair advantages in resolving this situation? The question was sharp but fair, and Zara had been expecting it. My father's position meant there were consequences for discriminatory behavior that might not have existed for other passengers, Zara answered. That's not fair. It's tragic. Every passenger should be treated with the dignity I was eventually shown regardless of who their parents are or what they can afford. Her response was being broadcast live on social media, adding another layer to the viral conversation about privilege justice and institutional accountability. David's phone rang constantly during their walk through the terminal. Board members, communications directors, legal advisors, and reporters, all seeking statements, clarifications, or guidance on how to handle the exploding story. "Sir," his communications director said breathlessly when David finally answered, "We need to schedule a press conference immediately. The story is dominating social media, cable news is picking it up, and our stock price is fluctuating based on public sentiment about how this was handled." "How's the sentiment trending?" David asked. "Mixed, but generally positive. People are praising the swift consequences for the discriminatory employee, but there are questions about whether this represents broader cultural problems within the airline industry." David considered this as they walked toward the baggage claim area, where he could see news crews setting up equipment. The story was clearly too big to manage quietly. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning," David decided. "But make it clear that this isn't about damage control, it's about transparency and accountability. We're not defending our actions, we're explaining our values." Rebecca Walsh, who'd been walking behind them, had been live-streaming her own commentary throughout the flight and arrival process. Her teacher's perspective on the educational value of the evening's events had resonated with thousands of educators and parents who were using the incident as a conversation starter about prejudice and bystander intervention. "This is what real accountability looks like in 2024, Rebecca told her viewers as they collected luggage. Swift, meaningful consequences for discriminatory behavior combined with recognition for those who stood up for justice. This should be the standard response, not an exception that makes headlines." Her streaming audience had grown from a few hundred followers to over 50,000 in the span of 6 hours, with educators across the country requesting permission to use her videos as teaching tools for discussing bias, courage, and community responsibility. Maria Santos had been overwhelmed by the attention her intervention had received. Her quiet moment of courage, speaking up for a stranger who was being treated unfairly, had been viewed millions of times and praised by civil rights organizations as an example of effective allyship. "I never thought I was doing anything special," Maria told a reporter who'd sought her out at baggage claim. "I just saw someone being treated badly and knew I had to say something. That's what we should all do when we see injustice." Her simple statement became one of the most shared quotes from the entire incident, encapsulating the kind of moral clarity that people desperately wanted to see in an increasingly polarized world. James Rodriguez had been contacted by veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and airline industry publications, all seeking his perspective on the evening's events as both a military veteran and aviation professional. "What impressed me most," James told CNN during a phone interview from the airport, "wasn't the corporate response, though. That was appropriate. It was watching ordinary passengers choose courage over convenience. That young woman needed support, and people stepped up even though they had nothing to gain from getting involved." But perhaps the most significant media development was happening organically across social platforms, where people were sharing their own stories of discrimination and discussing the role of bystander intervention in combating prejudice. My Gate 7 began trending as passengers shared experiences of being profiled, questioned, or mistreated while traveling. But equally important was I Stood Up, where people shared stories of intervening when they witnessed discrimination. The hashtags created a massive crowdsourced database of travel discrimination experiences that advocacy groups were already analyzing to identify patterns and push for industry-wide changes. David's corporate phone rang with a call from the CEO of a competing airline. "David, I wanted to congratulate you on your handling of tonight's situation," the caller said. "It's exactly the kind of leadership our industry needs." "Thank you. But this isn't about leadership," David replied. "It's about basic human decency. The fact that treating people fairly makes headlines tells us how low our standards have fallen." "Agreed. But I'm calling because we want to coordinate on industry-wide changes. This story has made discrimination in aviation a national conversation, and we have an opportunity to lead meaningful reform." David felt a surge of optimism. If competing airlines were ready to collaborate on addressing discriminatory practices, the impact of Zara's experience could extend far beyond elite airways. As they finally reached the exit of JFK Airport, David and Zara were greeted by a crowd of supporters who'd seen the story online and come to the airport to show solidarity. Signs reading, "Dignity can't be bought," and "Thank you for standing up" were held by a diverse group of travelers, civil rights activists, and ordinary New Yorkers who'd been moved by the evening's events. "This is incredible," Zara said, looking at the crowd of strangers who'd chosen to spend their New Year's Eve at an airport to support someone they'd never met. "This is what happens when people see justice done properly," David replied. It gives them hope that change is possible. As they walked through the crowd shaking hands and accepting thanks from the supporters, Zara felt the weight of her new public role settling over her. She'd become a symbol of something larger than herself, the possibility that ordinary people could stand up to discrimination and win. But more importantly, she'd become part of a community that had formed around the simple principle that dignity should be universal, not dependent on wealth, status, or family connections. The viral impact of Gay Day 7 was just beginning, but its message was already clear: when people choose courage over convenience, and institutions choose accountability over damage control, justice remains possible even in an imperfect world. The lobby of the Elite Airways corporate headquarters in Manhattan was packed with reporters, cameras, and concerned stakeholders by 8 a.m. on New Year's Day. What should have been a quiet holiday morning had instead become one of the most significant press conferences in the airline industry's recent history. David Mitchell stood at the podium, wearing a simple navy suit, with Zara beside him in a cream-colored dress she'd designed herself. Behind them, enlarged screenshots of the viral videos played silently on monitors, providing visual context for the story that had dominated social media overnight. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, "thank you for joining us this morning. I'm here to discuss the events that occurred at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport last night, not because I want to relitigate what happened, but because transparency and accountability are essential when institutions fail the people they're supposed to serve." The first question came from a veteran airline industry reporter, Mr. Mitchell. "Your daughter experienced discrimination from your own employee. How does that reflect on your leadership and company culture?" David had expected this question and had spent hours preparing his response. "It reflects a failure of leadership, my leadership in ensuring that our values were being lived out at every level of our organization," David replied honestly. "We had policies against discrimination, but we clearly hadn't created a culture where those policies were consistently enforced. 14 complaints about the same employee over 6 months should have resulted in corrective action long before last night." Zara stepped closer to the microphone. "If I may add something, what happened to me last night wasn't unique. The uniqueness was in the response. Most passengers who experience discrimination don't have a CEO father to call. They endure the humiliation file complaints that get buried and continue to be treated as second-class citizens despite being first-class passengers." Her response shifted the focus from corporate failure to societal issues, broadening the conversation beyond Elite Airways to the travel industry as a whole. Ms. Mitchell, a civil rights reporter, asked, "Some critics are saying that your father's swift response represents privilege rather than justice. How do you respond to that?" Zara had been dreading this question but knew it was important to address directly. "They're absolutely right," she said, surprising several reporters. "I received justice last night because of who my father is. That's not fair, it's tragic. Every passenger should receive the dignity and respect I was eventually shown, regardless of their family connections or bank account balance." Her honest acknowledgement of privilege while calling for universal justice resonated throughout the room. This wasn't a defensive response, it was a call for structural change. David retook the microphone. "Which is why we're announcing several initiatives this morning that extend far beyond our company." He gestured to a screen behind him that displayed a comprehensive reform package. First, Elite Airways is implementing the Dignity Charter, a set of customer service principles that prioritize respect over revenue, character over appearance. Every employee will be retrained, and discrimination complaints will be reviewed within 24 hours by executive leadership. The screen showed specific metrics, complaint response times, bias training requirements, and customer feedback monitoring methods. Second, we're establishing the Travelers Justice Fund, a $10 million initiative to provide legal support for passengers who experience discrimination by any airline. This isn't about Elite Airways, this is about industry-wide accountability. Several reporters exchanged glances. A corporate CEO using company resources to fund legal action against the entire industry, including his own company, was unprecedented. Third, we're partnering with civil rights organizations to create the National Travel Dignity Database, a transparent public record of discrimination complaints across all airlines. Passengers deserve to know which companies prioritize respect and which ones don't. Maria Santos, who had accepted David's offer to join Elite Airways as a customer experience consultant, stepped forward to address the crowd. "I'm Maria Santos. Last night I witnessed discrimination and chose to speak up. Today I'm joining Elite Airways to help ensure that other passengers never face what Zara experienced. But more importantly, I'm here to tell other witnesses that your voices matter. Silence enables discrimination. Speaking up prevents it." Her presence at the press conference sent a powerful message about the company's commitment to change. This wasn't just policy reform, it was cultural transformation led by the people who'd stood up for justice. James Rodriguez had been invited to participate via video conference from Phoenix, where he was spending New Year's Day with family. Mr. Rodriguez, a military affairs reporter, asked as a veteran and former pilot, "What's your assessment of how this situation was handled?" "I've served in combat zones where people made life and death decisions under extreme pressure," James replied from the screen. "Last night wasn't a life and death situation, but it was a character test." Zara Mitchell passed with flying colors. The passengers who supported her passed. The CEO, who held people accountable, passed. The employee who discriminated and the passengers who encouraged it failed spectacularly. His military authority lent weight to the moral assessment, framing the incident in terms of character rather than policy disputes. Rebecca Walsh joined the video conference from her home in Phoenix, where she was preparing lesson plans based on the previous night's events. As an educator, Rebecca said, "I see this as a teachable moment about bystander intervention. Too often, people witness discrimination and stay silent because they don't want to get involved. Last night proved that when ordinary people choose courage over convenience, justice becomes possible." A reporter from an education publication asked, "How are you using this incident in your curriculum?" "We're developing a complete unit on moral courage using last night's videos to discuss bias recognition intervention strategies and community responsibility," Rebecca replied. "Students need to see what it looks like when people choose to act on their values rather than just talk about them." The press conference was being live-streamed across multiple platforms, with real-time engagement numbers showing millions of viewers. Comments were overwhelmingly positive, with people praising the transparency and comprehensive response to the discrimination incident. But the most powerful moment came when David invited questions about the personal impact on his family. Mr. Mitchell, a family-focused reporter, asked, "How has this experience affected your relationship with your daughter?" David looked at Zara with obvious pride before answering. "Last night I watched my daughter handle humiliation and discrimination with more grace than I might have shown. She refused to use my name to get special treatment, insisted on being judged by her character rather than her connections, and turned a personal trauma into a teachable moment for thousands of people." He paused, his voice taking on a more emotional tone. "But more importantly, I watched strangers, people who owed her nothing, choose to stand up for her because it was right. That gives me hope for the future we're building together." Zara stepped forward for the final time. "I want to say something directly to other young people who might be watching this. What happened to me last night was wrong, but it wasn't unique. Discrimination happens every day to people who don't have cameras recording or CEOs for fathers. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" She looked directly into the camera. "If you see someone being treated unfairly, speak up. If you witness discrimination, document it. If you have privilege, use it to protect people who don't. And if you experience injustice, know that you're not alone, and that change is possible when people choose courage over convenience. The press conference ended with sustained applause from the reporters, an unusual response that reflected the moral clarity and comprehensive response to a situation that could have been handled with typical corporate damage control. As David and Zara walked off the stage, they both understood that their lives had changed permanently. They'd become public figures in the fight against discrimination with all the opportunities and responsibilities that role entailed. But they'd also proven that when institutions choose accountability over defensiveness and individuals choose courage over comfort, justice remains possible even in an imperfect world. The real test would come in the months ahead as policies became practices and public attention moved on to other stories. But the foundation had been laid for lasting change, built on the simple principle that dignity should be universal rather than conditional. 6 months after the Gate A7 incident, the impact was visible throughout the airline industry and beyond. What had begun as one young woman's experience with discrimination had evolved into a movement that changed how companies responded to bias complaints and how communities supported victims of prejudice. Victoria Blackwood's fall from grace had been swift and complete. No major airline would hire her after the viral videos documented her discriminatory behavior. She'd eventually found work at a small regional airport in rural Ohio, processing baggage claims for a fraction of her previous salary. The contrast between her former position of authority and her current circumstances served as a stark reminder that discrimination carried real consequences. But Victoria's punishment was less significant than the broader changes her actions had inadvertently inspired. The Elite Airways Dignity Charter had become an industry standard, with competing airlines implementing similar policies to avoid their own viral discrimination scandals. Customer complaint procedures had been streamlined across the industry, with bias incidents requiring executive review within 24 hours. Preston Montgomery's business had suffered significantly from his ban from major airlines. His inability to travel efficiently for client meetings had cost him several major accounts, and his company's reputation had been damaged by viral videos showing him supporting discriminatory treatment. He'd been forced to sell his Manhattan apartment and downsize his lifestyle dramatically, a humbling experience that had allegedly led to some personal reflection about privilege and prejudice. Officer Kane had been terminated from airport security and was now working as a mall security guard in suburban Phoenix. His failure to conduct basic investigatory procedures before threatening to arrest a passenger had become a case study in police training programs about the importance of independent investigation rather than blind deference to authority. But the positive changes were far more significant than any individual punishments. Maria Santos had excelled in her role as Elite Airways customer experience consultant, developing training programs that emphasized dignity and respect for all passengers, regardless of appearance or background. Her frontline experience as both a nurse and a mother had given her unique insights into creating inclusive customer service practices. "People don't want special treatment," Maria explained to a group of airline executives at an industry conference. "They want fair treatment. The difference is crucial. Special treatment creates resentment, but fair treatment creates loyalty." Her training programs had been adopted by airlines across the country, with customer satisfaction scores improving dramatically wherever her dignity-focused approaches were implemented. James Rodriguez had become a sought-after speaker on bystander intervention and moral courage. His military background and the viral video of his intervention had made him a powerful advocate for people who witness discrimination to speak up rather than remain silent. "In the military, we have a saying, 'Leave no one behind,'" James told audiences. "That principle shouldn't end when you take off the uniform. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you have a choice. Be part of the solution or be part of the problem through your silence." Rebecca Walsh had developed a comprehensive curriculum on recognizing and responding to bias that was being used in schools across the country. Her educational materials used the Gate A7 videos as teachable moments about moral courage, community responsibility, and the power of ordinary people to create change. Students need to see what it looks like when people act on their values, Rebecca explained to education reporters. Too often, we teach about historical heroes who stood up to injustice without showing them that they can be heroes in their own lives. The National Travel Dignity Database had become a powerful tool for tracking discrimination patterns across the airline industry. The transparent public record of bias complaints had forced companies to address problems they'd previously been able to hide or ignore. Zara Mitchell had graduated from Parsons with honors and launched her fashion line Dignity Designs, which specialized in high-quality, comfortable clothing that challenged assumptions about who belonged in luxury spaces. Her signature piece, a premium hoodie with the words, "Judge Character, Not Appearance," embroidered subtly on the sleeve, had become a symbol of the movement her experience had inspired. But more importantly, Zara had become a powerful advocate for travel equity, working with civil rights organizations to document and combat discrimination in the hospitality industry. "What happened to me was terrible," Zara said during a TEDx talk 6 months after the incident. "But what happened after was beautiful. Strangers chose to stand up for someone they didn't know because it was right. That's the world we can build when we choose courage over convenience." David Mitchell had transformed Elite Airways into the industry leader in customer dignity practices. The company's stock price had initially fluctuated after the incident, but had ultimately reached record highs as customers chose to fly with an airline that demonstrably prioritized respect over profit. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was cultural. The phrase Gate A7 justice had entered common usage to describe swift, meaningful consequences for discriminatory behavior. The incident had become a reference point for how institutions should respond when their values were tested under pressure. More importantly, the community of witnesses who'd supported Zara had stayed in touch, creating lasting friendships based on shared values and mutual respect. They'd proven that moral courage was contagious. When people saw others standing up for justice, they were more likely to act courageously themselves. 6 months later, Zara boards another Elite Airways flight, this time wearing a designer dress from her own fashion line. The gate agent, a young Hispanic woman trained under the new dignity protocols, greets her warmly by name. No assumptions, no judgment, just professional respect that every passenger deserves. As Zara settles into her seat, she texts her father smoothboarding today. "Your policies are working." David, now recognized as an industry leader in equality initiatives, responds. "The real change started with your courage that New Year's Eve. Proud of you always." The plane lifts off into clear skies, carrying passengers who know they'll be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, background, or bank account. In seat 2, the same seat where everything began, sits a young college student in jeans and a hoodie reading quietly while waiting for takeoff. No one questions his right to be there. No one assumes he doesn't belong, because sometimes it takes one moment of injustice to create a lifetime of change, and one father's love to ensure it never happens again. The story of Gate A7 reminds us that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create through our choices, our courage, and our commitment to treating every person with the dignity they deserve. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, courage, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. And remember, the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, you have a choice: be part of the solution or be part of the problem through your silence. Choose courage. Choose justice. Choose to be the person who stands up when it matters most. What would you have done in Zara's situation? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Until next time, keep fighting for a world where dignity is universal, not conditional.